I am 65. I used to believe family meant loyalty. At Easter dinner, my daughter-in-law threw a crystal wine glass at my face because I refused to house her bankrupt parents. It shattered on impact. Blood ran down my cheek. My son didn't help me. He called me selfish. I didn't argue. I didn't react. I drove myself to the emergency room. Then I made one phone call. They thought it was a family dispute. It was the beginning of something else. Thank you for being here. Drop your city or country in the comments so I know where this story is reaching tonight. And a quick note, parts of this story are dramatized for storytelling and learning purposes. Any similarity to real people or locations is purely coincidental, but the lesson is absolutely intentional. The dining room felt airtight, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The rich scent of roasted lamb and layered perfume clung to the air, heavy and oppressive, masking the bitterness spreading across the long mahogany table. Crystal glasses reflected the chandelier's warm glow, but there was nothing warm about the atmosphere. I sat at the head of the table, posture straight, hands resting calmly near my plate, watching the performance unfold. Across from me were not loved ones, but predators wearing the familiar faces of family. Trenton sat directly opposite, shoulders stiff, jaw tight, his gaze flickering anxiously between me and his wife. He looked like a man preparing to execute a plan he had rehearsed too many times in his head. Beside him, Camille radiated entitlement as naturally as she wore her designer pearls. Her chin was slightly lifted, eyes sharp and appraising, as though she were evaluating a piece of property rather than addressing her father-in-law. To my right sat Howard and Cynthia Reed, Camille's bankrupt parents. Once proud enough to boast about risky ventures and visionary investments, they now wore desperation like a second skin. After liquidating what little they had left, they were weeks away from eviction, yet there was no humility in their posture. They stared at me with the quiet calculation of scavengers assessing the strength of wounded prey. The silence before Trenton spoke was not polite. It was loaded. It was the kind of silence that precedes an ambush. Trenton cleared his throat fingers, drumming a nervous rhythm against the white linen tablecloth. He pushed his untouched plate aside and leaned forward, elbows braced on the table. He said they had been discussing the future, as though this were a collaborative family meeting. He explained that Howard and Cynthia were being forced out of their temporary apartment at the end of the month. Then he looked at me directly, firmly, and informed me that it was time for me to open my home to them. He did not frame it as a request. He presented it as a solution that had already been agreed upon by everyone but me. He reasoned that I lived alone in a 4-bedroom estate, and that it was unreasonable, even immoral, for one older man to occupy so much unused space while families struggled. He spoke about fairness, about compassion, about duty. His tone carried the authority of someone who believed compliance was inevitable. He expected me to lower my head, surrender my sanctuary, and quietly absorb the burden of two people who had never shown me the slightest trace of respect. I studied Trenton's face, then Camille's. What I saw was not concern. It was calculation. They did not see my home as the place where I had built decades of work and memory. They saw square footage, asset value, liquidity. In their eyes, I was no longer a father. I was a resource nearing expiration, an aging widower with more space than leverage. Slowly, I set my silver fork down. The metallic click against porcelain echoed in the strained quiet, sharper than any raised voice. I lifted my gaze and looked directly at my son. When I spoke, my voice was steady, stripped of emotion. No. I told him clearly that my home was a private sanctuary, not a public shelter. I said that Howard and Cynthia were responsible for their own financial collapse, and that I would not carry the consequences of their reckless decisions. My tone did not waver. There was no anger in it, only finality. The explosion was immediate. Trenton slammed both palms onto the table, rattling crystal glasses and fine china. His face contorted into open fury. He called me selfish, miserable, a hoarder of space and wealth. He accused me of having a heart made of stone. His voice rose, echoing off the high ceilings, as he demanded to know what kind of father refuses to help his own family in their darkest hour. He said I valued empty guest rooms and dusty antiques more than blood. He told me I deserved to die alone in my massive empty house. Camille leaned forward, feeding the blaze, her cheeks flushed, eyes burning with indignation. She jabbed a manicured finger in my direction and began listing every perceived injustice she believed I had committed over the years. She called me controlling, tight-fisted, manipulative. She accused me of using my financial stability to make them feel inferior. Her words were sharp and rehearsed, as though she had been waiting for the right moment to release them. Howard and Cynthia said nothing. They did not need to. Their silence functioned as endorsement. Their stillness signaled agreement. They watched the verbal assault unfold with grim satisfaction. In that moment, the final illusion of familial respect dissolved. Whatever fragile veneer had once existed between us was gone. Beneath it lay something raw and venomous, an entitlement so deep it no longer bothered to disguise itself as love. I did not raise my voice to compete with theirs. I remained seated, allowing the insults to roll over me. I memorized them, every accusation, every distortion, every word intended to break me. When Camille paused for breath, I looked at her and said calmly that she was out of line. Then I turned to Trenton. I reminded him without theatrics that for the past 5 years, I had quietly subsidized his failing logistics company. I had kept him from bankruptcy court. I had absorbed losses he never acknowledged. I had shielded him from creditors who would have dismantled his operation within months. My assistance had not been public. It had not been paraded. It had simply existed. I told him that generosity has limits. My voice never rose. My posture never shifted. But something in my tone signaled a line had been drawn. They had come expecting surrender. What they received instead was refusal. And in that refusal, something fundamental changed. My refusal was the fracture point. The calm in my voice, the absence of fear, the simple word, no. Those were the final threads holding Camille's composure together. When she realized I would not bend, that I would not surrender my home or my will under collective pressure, something inside her snapped. The rejection did not merely anger her, it dismantled her. Her hand shot toward her crystal goblet. The stem was thick, the bowl wide, the glass heavy and expensive. It was filled nearly to the rim with dark red wine, the surface trembling from the force of her movement. There was a split second, a thin, fragile pause where reason might have returned. It did not. With a raw guttural scream that tore through the dining room, she hurled the goblet at my face. I had no time to react, no time to lift a hand in defense. The weighted base of the crystal struck me squarely on my right cheekbone, just beneath the eye. The sound was sharp and violent, a crack that seemed too loud for a private home. The goblet shattered on impact, exploding into shards that scattered across the mahogany table and onto the polished floor. A blinding surge of pain burst behind my eyes. It was immediate, white-hot, disorienting. Then came the warmth, thick, heavy, unmistakable. Blood streamed down my face, mixing with the spilled wine that splashed across my shirt and the wall behind me. Dark red bled into white linen, staining everything it touched. The shouting ceased instantly. The room fell into a crushing silence so complete it felt physical. Howard released a strangled, involuntary gasp. Cynthia clapped both hands over her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Trenton stood frozen, his expression drained of color, staring at the damage his wife had inflicted. He did not move toward me. He did not rebuke her. He did not ask if I was hurt. He simply took one slow, cautious step backward, as though distancing himself from responsibility. Camille remained standing at the table, chest rising and falling, rapidly, her hand empty her mind, struggling to comprehend the violence she had just committed. I did not shout. I did not curse. I did not reach for retaliation. Instead, the pain sharpened my focus. I rose slowly from my chair. The movement was deliberate, controlled. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and withdrew a pristine white linen handkerchief. With steady fingers, I pressed it firmly against the open wound on my cheek. I felt the fabric absorb the blood, almost instantly, warmth soaking through to my palm. I lifted my gaze. I looked at Trenton. Then I looked at Camille. I allowed them to see the void in my eyes. Not anger, not shock. Something colder, something calculated. Without another word, I turned my back on them. I walked out of the dining room, leaving the broken crystal, the overturned chairs, and the remains of Easter dinner behind me. I passed through the front door and stepped into the cool, open night air. The contrast was stark. Outside, the world was calm. The sky was dark and unbothered. Crickets hummed faintly in the distance. Inside, everything had changed. I walked to my car parked in the driveway. My steps were measured, my breathing steady. My hands did not tremble as I unlocked the door and slid behind the leather steering wheel. The metallic taste of blood mingled with the bitter residue of wine on my lips. I started the engine. I did not drive home. I drove toward the county hospital. Streetlights flickered rhythmically through the windshield, casting alternating shadows across the interior of the car. Each pulse of pain in my cheek reaffirmed a single truth. This was no longer a domestic disagreement. It had crossed into criminal violence. They had escalated the conflict beyond words. And in doing so, They had handed me the instrument I needed. I pulled into the emergency room parking lot, the fluorescent lights harsh against the darkness. I turned off the engine, but remained seated for a moment. The handkerchief in my hand was soaked through now, crimson spreading across the white fabric. I reached for my phone and dialed Jonathan Pierce. He answered on the second ring alert despite the late hour. I did not waste time with pleasantries. "Phase 1 is complete," I said. My voice echoed faintly inside the quiet car. I informed him that the assault had become physical, that Camille had struck me in the face with a heavy glass object, that I was currently bleeding in the hospital parking lot. Jonathan did not interrupt. He did not ask for dramatic detail. He simply acknowledged the information and stated that he was activating the protocols we had previously discussed. His tone was calm, precise. He instructed me to ensure that medical staff documented every injury thoroughly and to request a full report. I ended the call. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the sliding glass doors of the emergency entrance. The fluorescent lighting illuminated my reflection in the glass, blood streaked across my cheek shirt, stained expression unbroken. The automatic doors parted. Inside, the sterile brightness of the triage area replaced the cool night air. I approached the front desk with controlled steps. The nurse behind the counter looked up and visibly recoiled at the sight of my face. I stood straight. "I require immediate medical attention for a facial laceration," I said evenly. Then without hesitation I added, "And please contact the local police precinct. I need to file a formal felony assault report against my daughter-in-law." The words were measured, precise. This was no emotional outburst, no revenge-driven impulse. This was documentation. This was procedure. The nurse nodded, already reaching for the phone. As she called for assistance, I felt something settle inside me. The shouting at the dinner table had been chaos. This was order. The silent adjustment had begun, and the paper trail once started would not be erased. I did not return to my house that night. The silence there would have been too loud, too fresh, with the memory of shattered crystal and spilled blood. Jonathan Pierce arranged a private suite for me at a discreet downtown hotel far from Trenton's neighborhood and the curious eyes of neighbors. While I rested behind locked doors and drawn curtains, the legal machinery began to turn quietly, efficiently, without emotion. The following morning, I sat across from Jonathan in his sleek glass-walled office overlooking the city skyline. A cup of black coffee cooled in my hand, while the stitches along my cheek pulsed with a steady, controlled ache. The pain no longer felt chaotic. It felt useful. Jonathan did not offer hollow words of comfort. He did not ask how I was feeling. Instead, he rotated his laptop toward me and pressed play. The screen filled with the grainy clarity of police body camera footage from the previous evening. Two uniformed officers walked up the manicured stone pathway leading to Trenton and Camille's suburban home. The porch lights glowed warmly, giving the illusion of peace. Through the large front window, the camera captured a scene of absurd normalcy. Trenton, Camille, Howard, and Cynthia were seated at the dining table, sharing slices of gourmet cheesecake. They were laughing, forks clinked lightly against porcelain plates. Their faces were relaxed, satisfied. There was no sign of remorse, no sign of concern. They had sent me to the hospital bleeding, and yet they were celebrating dessert. They believed the confrontation had ended in their favor. They mistook my silence for weakness. They assumed I had retreated in defeat. What they did not know was that a night court judge had already signed a warrant for felony assault with a deadly weapon. On the screen, the lead officer raised his fist and knocked hard against the heavy oak door. The sound was deliberate and unyielding, echoing into the quiet suburban night. Inside, I saw Trenton pause mid-laugh. He frowned, dabbing his mouth with a napkin, irritation crossing his features. He rose from the table with visible annoyance rather than concern. In his mind, I suspect he assumed I had returned, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to negotiate. He walked toward the door with confidence, shoulders squared, prepared to deliver another lecture about my alleged selfishness. He opened the door and found himself staring into the impassive faces of two county sheriffs. Red and blue patrol lights flashed across his pale expression, bathing his features in alternating color. For a fleeting second, confusion flickered in his eyes. Then pride returned. Trenton puffed out his chest, attempting to reclaim authority. He asked what the officers wanted. He demanded to know why they were disturbing his family at such a late hour. The lead officer did not offer pleasantries. He did not acknowledge Trenton's tone. He simply shifted his gaze past Trenton's shoulder into the well-lit dining room and called out for Camille by her full legal name, instructing her to step forward and identify herself. On the screen, Camille froze halfway through a bite of cheesecake. The smug composure she had worn all evening dissolved instantly. Her fork hovered in the air before lowering slowly to the plate. Panic replaced arrogance. She stood unsteady. Trenton immediately moved to block the doorway, positioning himself between his wife and the officers as though he could physically shield her from consequence. He insisted that she had done nothing wrong. He described the incident as a minor family misunderstanding, exaggerated by an emotional old man. The lead officer did not engage in debate. He stepped across the threshold with quiet authority, forcing Trenton to stumble backward. The second officer followed closely, one hand resting calmly on his utility belt. They entered the dining room without hesitation. The mood shifted instantly. The polished wood table, the expensive china, the soft lighting, none of it offered protection. Howard and Cynthia shrank visibly in their seats, their confidence evaporating. The predatory posture they had displayed earlier vanished. They were no longer scavengers circling perceived weakness. They were witnesses to a power far greater than their own. The lead officer addressed Camille again this time, reading directly from the warrant clipped to his vest. His voice was steady, procedural, devoid of emotion. He informed her that she was under arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and felony elder abuse. The words seemed to hang in the air before landing with full force. Camille released a sharp, piercing shriek. She staggered backward, colliding with the edge of the mahogany table and knocking over a glass of water. She shouted that it was a lie. She insisted that I had attacked her. She demanded that Trenton intervene. Trenton fumbled for his phone, threatening to call the mayor, the police commissioner, anyone he believed might bend reality back in his favor. His voice rose brittle and desperate. The officers remained unmoved. The lead officer stepped forward and took Camille firmly by the wrist. His grip was controlled, practiced. With fluid efficiency, he guided her arm behind her back. The sound of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the dining room. It was a sharp, decisive click. Camille's composure collapsed entirely. Tears streaked down her face as she struggled against the restraint, her designer dress wrinkling and twisting beneath the officer's hold. Her earlier rage was gone, replaced by raw disbelief. I watched the footage without blinking. The illusion of control had shattered, and the law had entered their sanctuary uninvited. The officers marched Camille out of the dining room, dragging her toward the front door. She dragged her feet, pleading and crying loudly, begging Trenton to save her. Trenton followed them to the porch, shouting empty legal threats that the officers ignored. The neighborhood was wide awake. The flashing police lights had drawn the attention of every affluent resident on the street. Neighbors stood on their manicured lawns and peered through their front windows, watching the spectacle unfold. They saw Camille, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood association, being shoved into the back of a police cruiser in handcuffs, with her mascara running down her face. Her reputation was instantly and permanently destroyed. The cruiser doors slammed shut with a final metallic authority, cutting off Camille's hysterical screams mid-cry. The sound reverberated through the quiet suburban street like a judge's gavel. The officers climbed into the front seats without hesitation. Seconds later, the patrol car pulled away, red and blue lights flashing across manicured lawns and pristine facades. Trenton remained standing alone on his front lawn, illuminated by the harsh glare of security lights mounted above the garage. His silhouette looked smaller, now diminished. The confident host of moments earlier was gone. He stared after the departing cruiser as though disbelief alone might bring it back. Inside the house, Howard and Cynthia did not step forward to defend their daughter. They lingered in the shadows beyond the doorway, unwilling to share in the consequences of the chaos they had helped fuel. In Jonathan's silent office, I watched the footage without blinking. I felt no sympathy, no regret. Only the quiet mechanical satisfaction of precision. A trap once set correctly does not require emotion. It requires patience. And the trap had closed exactly as designed. Morning sunlight flooded through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the law office, casting long, angular shadows across the polished concrete floor. The heavy oak door was sealed shut, isolating us from the distant hum of the city below. I sat in a high-backed black leather chair, my stitched cheek pulsing faintly, my phone resting in my palm. The screen displayed 12 missed calls and 3 unheard voice messages, all from Trenton. Jonathan sat across from me, behind his expansive mahogany desk, posture immaculate, hands folded neatly atop a fresh legal pad. He instructed me to place the phone in the center of the desk and activate the speakers so that the contents could be formally documented. I set the device down. The automated voice system echoed into the room. The first message was time-stamped 2 a.m. Trenton sounded breathless. His voice bounced faintly distorted by the cavernous acoustics of the county jail waiting area. He did not ask how my face was healing. He did not inquire about the stitches. He did not express concern. He began with accusation. He demanded I stop acting dramatic. He informed me that Camille had been formally booked and was sitting in a holding cell alongside actual criminals. He ordered me to drive to the precinct, immediately tell the duty sergeant that I had fallen and injured myself, and withdraw the charges. He insisted the situation was a gross overreaction to a simple misunderstanding. According to him, I was embarrassing the family. He told me to fix my mistake. The message ended abruptly with the sharp click of disconnection. Jonathan made a single deliberate notation on his pad. I felt nothing. The second message arrived 45 minutes later. The transformation in tone was stark. The commanding arrogance had dissolved into uncontrolled rage. Trenton was shouting now, the sterile hum of the police station barely audible beneath his fury. He screamed that the night magistrate had imposed an enormous cash bail because the charge was classified as a violent felony against a vulnerable elderly individual. He blamed me entirely for the financial burden. He called me vindictive, spiteful, a bitter old man who could not tolerate his son's success. He declared that if I did not correct the situation before sunrise, he would sever all contact permanently. He threatened to remove me from their lives and let me rot alone in my empty house. He claimed Howard and Cynthia were traumatized by the arrest. He called me a monster. I glanced at Jonathan. He raised one eyebrow calculating, but remained silent. The room absorbed Trenton's rage without reaction. The final message was recorded shortly after 6 a.m. The background noise had shifted to the low vibration of a car engine. Trenton had posted bail. Camille's sobbing could be heard faintly from the passenger seat, her cries raw and unfiltered. Trenton was no longer shouting. His voice was cold now, controlled, flat. He told me they were driving home. He said the gloves were off. He declared that I had crossed an unforgivable line and had declared war on my own blood. He promised I would pay for humiliating his wife publicly. Then came the real threat. He stated he would contact his own attorneys and petition the court to declare me mentally incompetent. He swore he would prove I was unfit to live alone. He vowed to have me forcibly removed from my home and committed to a state facility. He said he would take control of my estate, liquidate the property, and use the proceeds to protect Camille from prison. He finished by telling me I was dead to him. The room fell silent as the message ended. Jonathan reached forward calmly and tapped the screen, transferring the audio files to his secure server. The hum of the upload bar filled the stillness. He leaned back slightly and looked at me, eyes sharp, analytical. He just gave us exactly what we needed, he said. Trenton believed he was issuing threats. In reality, he was confessing intent. And intent once documented becomes leverage. The trap had not only closed, it had recorded itself. The silence that followed the final voicemail was dense and absolute. Trenton's threats lingered in the air of Jonathan's office like a corrosive fog. His voice, cold, certain, venomous, still echoed faintly in my mind. He truly believed he held all the leverage. In his imagination, I was nothing more than an aging man clinging to a single valuable property, a frail obstacle standing between him and the life he felt entitled to claim. In Trenton's version of reality, he was the visionary entrepreneur, the rising titan of industry. I was the relic, outdated, irrelevant, easily displaced. He saw himself as a self-made success story, forged by ambition and grit. He saw me as a burden in the way of his inevitable expansion. The delusion would have been almost amusing if it were not wrapped so tightly around genuine malice. Jonathan Pierce allowed the silence to settle. He did not interrupt my thoughts with commentary or reassurance. Instead, he leaned forward and unlocked the heavy-bottom drawer of his mahogany desk. From within, he retrieved a thick black leather binder and placed it carefully between us. This was not a folder containing medical directives or modest retirement statements. This binder held the complete operational framework and private financial records of Summit Commercial Management. I am not a man surviving on a predictable pension. For 40 relentless years, I acquired, developed, and managed high-value commercial real estate throughout the state. I built a portfolio, methodically property by property, contract by contract. I structured it behind layered corporate trusts and holding entities designed for insulation and longevity. I never needed public recognition. I needed stability, leverage, and control. When my wife passed away, I chose simplicity. I remained in our family home. I drove an older vehicle. I wore practical clothes. I had no desire to broadcast wealth. There was nothing left to prove. But Trenton interpreted restraint as decline. He mistook discretion for weakness. He assumed that my quiet lifestyle reflected dwindling resources rather than disciplined abundance. Jonathan opened the binder and turned to its central tab. He slid a clean, crisp legal document toward me across the polished desk surface. It was the master lease agreement for a massive industrial warehouse complex on the southern edge of the city, the very facility from which Trenton operates his booming logistics enterprise. 5 years earlier, Trenton had walked into my living room wearing a tailored suit purchased on borrowed confidence. He demanded a substantial cash infusion to launch his delivery and warehousing company. He spoke to me with thinly veiled contempt, dismissing my conservative financial counsel as obsolete. He called himself a natural entrepreneur. He insisted I lacked vision. I refused to hand him unrestricted capital. I knew his arrogance would devour liquidity faster than revenue could replace it. But at that time, I still loved my son without condition. I wanted him to succeed even if he did not value my guidance. So, I intervened quietly. Through one of my holding companies, I purchased the warehouse complex he had been eyeing. Then, through Summit Commercial Management, I extended him a long-term commercial lease at a rate so far below market value, it bordered on absurd. The current market rate for that size facility in that location is $40,000 per month. Trenton pays $8,000. For 5 consecutive years, I have absorbed a $32,000 monthly deficit through my corporate structure. That deficit was not a clerical error. It was deliberate support. Every month, without recognition, without gratitude, without disclosure, I sustained his company. I have been the invisible foundation beneath his entire operation. At country clubs, Trenton boasts about razor-thin efficiency and exceptional margins. He presents himself as a self-made executive with uncommon instinct. He purchases diamond necklaces for Camille. He leases imported sports cars. He funds a lifestyle that suggests success. He believes the numbers on his profit and loss statements validate his genius. He does not realize those numbers are artificially stabilized by my silent subsidy. Without the reduced lease rate, his overhead would have crushed his margins within the first year. Without my intervention, creditors would have dismantled his operation long ago. The franchise he parades as proof of superiority is structurally dependent on generosity he now repays with threats. His empire is not steel and concrete. It is paper and illusion, and illusions collapse the moment reality withdraws support. Jonathan closed the binder slowly. Trenton believes he declared war. What he has actually done is threaten the architect of the very ground he stands upon, and foundations once removed do not negotiate. Jonathan lifted a silver pen and tapped the final paragraph of the master lease agreement. The gesture was small, almost casual, but the implication was enormous. His pen rested directly on the stringent morality and default provisions we had embedded deep within the original contract clauses drafted with precision, buried beneath layers of dense legal language. Trenton had believed he was negotiating from a position of strength when he signed that lease 5 years ago. Convinced he had outmaneuvered a struggling corporate landlord, he rushed through the documents without retaining competent counsel. He skimmed, assumed, and signed. In his arrogance, he agreed to a provision granting the landlord immediate and uncontested termination rights if the primary tenant or any immediate family member became subject to violent criminal charges. He never imagined that clause would apply to him. By allowing Camille to assault me and subsequently face felony charges, Trenton had triggered the very mechanism that would dismantle his own enterprise. The destruction of his company was not emotional, it was contractual. He had unknowingly signed his own financial execution order, and the architect of that consequence was seated across from me in a quiet law office. I studied the bold, overconfident signature at the bottom of the page. My son's name written with flourish and certainty now bound him to the outcome he never foresaw. He had declared me mentally unfit. He had attempted to weaponize the probate court to seize my home and liquidate my estate in order to shield his wife from prison. He intended to dismantle my life entirely. I looked up at Jonathan. "Draft the eviction notice," I said evenly, "and the lease termination documents." My instructions were deliberate. The papers were not to be emailed, not couriered casually. They would be printed on premium heavy stock paper and placed inside a sealed unmarked envelope. I would deliver them personally. The lifeline that had sustained him for 5 years, the silent subsidy that preserved his illusion of success, was officially severed. I remained at the hotel for 2 additional days. I did not contact Trenton. I did not respond to his calls. Silence can be more destabilizing than confrontation. I knew his temperament well. Arrogance rarely tolerates uncertainty. Backed into a corner by criminal charges and unaware of the financial collapse advancing toward him, he would react predictably. Desperation sharpens recklessness. On the third morning, a heavy knock echoed through the suite. It was sharp and authoritative. I opened the door to find a man in a poorly fitted gray suit, holding a thick manila envelope. He confirmed my name, then pressed the envelope firmly against my chest. "You've been served," he said flatly before turning down the hallway. I closed the door and carried the packet to the desk near the window. The wax seal cracked cleanly under my thumb. Inside was a substantial stack of legal documents stamped with the bold red insignia of the county probate court. Trenton had escalated. He had filed an emergency petition seeking temporary medical conservatorship. I read the petition slowly, my expression unchanged. He was asking a judge to strip me of my autonomy and transfer control of my health care and finances to him. The narrative he constructed was elaborate. He alleged severe and rapidly progressing dementia. He claimed I suffered from paranoid delusions and episodes of violent self-harm. Most grotesque was his distortion of the Easter dinner incident. According to his sworn statement, Camille had not attacked me. Instead, he asserted that I had experienced a psychotic break and smashed the crystal goblet into my own face while verbally abusing them. He portrayed himself as a burdened, exhausted son, seeking court intervention to protect his unstable father from further harm. It was malicious fiction, carefully composed. To obtain an emergency order, the court required medical validation. Trenton had anticipated that requirement. Attached to the petition was a sworn affidavit from a licensed psychiatrist. I recognized the name immediately. He had attended Camille's dinner parties, expensive evenings filled with curated wine and calculated flattery. He had a reputation for lavish tastes and a discreet but widely rumored gambling problem. Without examining me, without conducting an evaluation, he had signed a legal document diagnosing me with severe cognitive decline and violent psychosis. He had traded professional integrity for influence. Based on that affidavit, the judge granted a temporary 14-day emergency injunction. The final pages detailed the immediate consequences. Trenton had been awarded temporary power of attorney over my healthcare decisions and certain financial accounts. Attached to the packet was correspondence from my primary retail bank. My personal checking and savings accounts, the modest accounts used for pension deposits and daily expenses, had been frozen. Trenton believed he had executed a strategic masterstroke. By restricting my liquidity, he assumed I would be unable to retain counsel or maintain accommodations. He thought deprivation would force submission. He believed he had neutralized me. He did not understand that those accounts were decoys, functional but insignificant components of a far more complex structure. I retrieved my phone and called Jonathan. I read the injunction line by line. He did not express alarm. His tone was measured analytical. "They've committed perjury," he said, "and the psychiatrist has exposed himself to federal medical fraud." By filing knowingly false affidavits with the probate court, Trenton and the physician had transformed a domestic dispute into a criminal conspiracy. I asked about the frozen accounts. Jonathan reassured me immediately. The wealth contained within Summit Commercial Management and its affiliated trusts was legally insulated. Those entities existed under separate tax identification numbers, governed by layered holding structures and asset protection frameworks. Trenton was unaware of their existence. He had frozen the visible accounts, the ones designed to appear ordinary: groceries, utilities, minor transactions. He believed he had isolated me financially. In reality, he had revealed intent. Every false statement in that petition, every fabricated diagnosis, every fraudulent signature, each action was documented and time-stamped. He thought he was closing in. Instead, he was stepping deeper into exposure. The lease termination sat drafted and ready. The eviction notice awaited delivery. The conservatorship petition provided new leverage. Trenton assumed he was seizing control of the board. He did not realize the game had always been structured around contingencies he could not see, and now he had moved precisely where I needed him to. I stood at the wide hotel window, looking down at the relentless movement of the city below. Cars streamed through intersections. Pedestrians crossed streets with purpose. Life continued indifferent and orderly. My stitched cheek pulsed with a steady, controlled ache, but my thoughts were razor sharp. Pain clarifies. Betrayal simplifies. Trenton believed he was holding a winning hand. In his mind, he had cornered me. He thought he had locked me inside a legal cage and severed the only financial artery keeping me alive. He believed he had acted decisively, brilliantly. What he did not understand was that I had left the door open on purpose. I had allowed him to obtain that temporary authority, because I knew exactly what a desperate, greedy man would do once handed even a fragment of control. He would not exercise restraint. He would overreach. He would stretch his new power beyond its legal boundaries in an attempt to secure something far larger. He would try to save himself, and in doing so, he would expose himself completely. I had been waiting for retaliation, waiting for escalation. The moment he filed that fraudulent conservatorship petition, the final piece slid into place. The stage was set. The Trojan horse was already inside his gates, he just did not know it. The following afternoon I returned to my property. The wrought iron gates parted silently, and my car moved up the long, curved driveway toward the sprawling stone estate I had built through decades of measured risk and calculated discipline. Ancient oaks framed the property. The lawns were trimmed with geometric precision. From the outside, it looked exactly as it always had. But the atmosphere had shifted. This was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield. I parked in the garage and entered through the side door, stepping into the cool stillness of the grand foyer. Marble floors reflected the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. Everything was orderly, untouched. Less than an hour later, the quiet was shattered by the deep rumble of a large engine. I moved to the front window and looked down. Trenton's oversized luxury SUV was parked directly on my front lawn, its wide tires carving careless tracks into the manicured grass. He had not bothered to use the driveway. The act was deliberate, territorial. He stepped out of the vehicle with the posture of a conqueror surveying newly claimed land. The rear doors opened. Howard and Cynthia emerged dragging oversized plastic suitcases behind them. The cheap wheels rattled loudly against the pavement. They paused at the base of the steps and stared up at the house, their expressions unguarded and hungry. They did not look like concerned relatives. They looked like scavengers arriving at a carcass. I turned away from the window and walked to the front door. I unlocked the heavy mahogany panels and pulled them open just as Trenton reached the top step. He did not greet me. He did not glance at the bandage covering my cheek. He did not inquire about my condition. Instead, he lifted a thick manila folder and pushed past me into the foyer as though he already owned it. Howard and Cynthia followed, dragging their plastic luggage across my polished marble floors without hesitation. I closed the door quietly and faced them. Trenton slapped the folder onto my antique console table with theatrical authority. "The court granted the order," he said, his tone saturated with triumph. "I now have full temporary control." He announced that a judge had determined I was a danger to myself, that I was mentally unstable, that I could no longer be trusted to live alone. Then he gestured grandly toward his in-laws. "They're moving in," he declared, effective immediately. 24-hour supervision. He framed it as generosity, as sacrifice. He claimed they were giving up their time to monitor a sick, paranoid old man. The truth was far simpler. He was installing wardens. He intended to confine me, socially monitor my communications, and control access to my property, while draining what he believed were my frozen assets. Howard puffed out his chest and surveyed the foyer with grotesque satisfaction. "Don't worry," he said smoothly. "We'll take excellent care of everything while you adjust." Cynthia drifted toward a bronze sculpture near the staircase, running her fingers lightly across its surface. I caught the faint whisper of her calculating how much it might fetch at a private auction. They expected resistance. They expected rage. They expected the volatile outburst Trenton had described in his petition. Instead, I gave them nothing. I allowed my shoulders to sag. I introduced the faintest tremor into my hands. I lowered my gaze to the marble floor. When I spoke, I let my voice thin and rasp. "I'm very tired," I said quietly. "My head hurts. I just want to rest." I did not challenge the court order. I did not demand they leave. I did not protest. I nodded slowly as if confused. I shuffled slightly as I turned away, imitating the disorientation Trenton had sworn under oath defined me. The performance was seamless. Behind me, I felt the immediate shift. Trenton exhaled sharply relief, disguised as dominance. Howard's posture relaxed. Cynthia's nervous energy transformed into indulgent curiosity. Trenton laughed, short, sharp, satisfied. "Take the guest suites on the east wing," he told Howard and Cynthia. "Make yourselves comfortable." He instructed them to lock the exterior doors, to monitor my movements, to ensure I did not wander and embarrass the family again. He spoke about me as if I were an aging animal in need of containment. He believed he had broken me. He thought the sight of an official court order had crushed the last of my resistance. I moved slowly toward the sweeping staircase. My hand gripped the wooden banister firmly, not from weakness, but to maintain the illusion. Each step was measured and heavy. At the top landing, I paused briefly, then continued down the long hallway toward my master suite. The corridor was silent, controlled. Once inside my bedroom, I closed the heavy oak door carefully. Then, I turned the deadbolt. The metallic click echoed through the room, solid, final, deeply satisfying. For the first time that day, I allowed my shoulders to straighten. The tremor vanished. My breathing stabilized. They believed I was contained. They believed they were in control. But they had just moved into a structure whose foundation they did not understand. They thought they had invaded my sanctuary. In truth, they had entered my arena. And the door they had walked through so confidently was already closing behind them. The instant the deadbolt clicked into place, the frail, defeated old man ceased to exist. I straightened slowly, vertebra by vertebra, until my spine aligned with deliberate precision. The tremor vanished from my hands. The weakness drained from my posture. I crossed the room and drew the heavy velvet curtains closed, sealing the master suite in cool, controlled shadow. The sunlight disappeared. So did the performance. I moved to my private mahogany desk and knelt beside it, sliding open the false bottom drawer, concealed beneath a stack of harmless documents. From within, I retrieved a sleek encrypted tablet encased in matte black carbon fiber. The invasion had unfolded exactly as anticipated. They had breached the perimeter of my sanctuary and planted themselves in my foyer with the swagger of conquerors. They believed they were seizing spoils from a fallen adversary. They believed the war was over. They did not realize they had locked themselves inside a structure designed to contain them. Patience had always been my advantage. Now the waiting phase was complete. The game had entered its next stage. I pressed the power button. The screen illuminated with a cold, sterile glow, the light of surveillance of documentation of truth, captured without distortion. The faint blue radiance from the tablet spilled across the darkened walls of my suite. I settled into my heavy leather armchair and listened to the distant echo of footsteps below. Howard and Cynthia were exploring, claiming space, touching surfaces, testing boundaries. They were entirely unaware that the ground beneath their feet no longer belonged to me as an individual. Trenton believed the emergency conservatorship order had handed him a prize of immeasurable value. In his mind, he had secured a multi-million-dollar estate, a tangible asset he could eventually liquidate to rescue his wife from criminal consequences. His strategy depended on one fatal assumption, that my greatest wealth sat unprotected and personally titled in my name. He was profoundly mistaken. 6 months earlier, I had noticed subtle changes in Trenton's behavior. His eyes lingered too long on my antique silver collection. He asked pointed questions about property taxes, estate planning, insurance beneficiaries. His curiosity was not affectionate. It was acquisitive. I recognized the hunger of a man staring at a lifeboat he intended to commandeer. I did not confront him. I did not warn him. Instead, I scheduled a meeting with Jonathan Pierce. Over the course of several weeks, we executed a meticulous and entirely lawful restructuring of my assets. I relinquished personal ownership of the estate. The deed title and all associated rights were transferred into an irrevocable blind trust managed by Jonathan and a board of independent fiduciary trustees. The trust was insulated, autonomous, untouchable by family court maneuvering. When the probate judge signed the temporary injunction, he granted Trenton authority over Alistair Wallace, the individual. He gave him access to modest personal accounts and the authority to dictate my medical care. But Alistair Wallace, the individual, no longer owned the sprawling stone estate. Trenton had stormed a castle whose treasury had already been relocated. He could not sell the house. He could not leverage it as collateral. He could not even legally remove me from residency. The trust stipulations guaranteed my right to inhabit the property indefinitely. He stood in my foyer, believing he possessed dominion over a kingdom that did not legally exist in my name. His victory was theatrical, hollow, but a shield alone would not suffice. I required a blade. During the same week the trust was finalized, I retained a private security firm, specializing in discreet corporate surveillance infrastructure. They did not mount visible cameras or leave blinking indicators. For 4 days, technicians worked quietly within the architectural framework of the house. Microscopic lenses were integrated into crown-molding ventilation, grates, and recessed lighting housings. Audio sensors were embedded behind custom wall panels. Every common living area, foyer, hallways, kitchen, formal living room was covered. The only spaces excluded were private bathrooms, ensuring compliance with legal standards. Every feed recorded in pristine 4K resolution with synchronized audio capture. Because the property was owned by a corporate entity, and the surveillance was confined to common areas of a privately managed structure, the installation was entirely lawful and admissible in court. There was no reasonable expectation of privacy in a corporate-owned foyer. I had transformed my home into a recording instrument. I unlocked the tablet with my biometric authentication. The screen divided into a grid of 16 live feeds. The dark suite receded from my awareness as the interior of my home reappeared in luminous detail. The trap was active. In the hallway camera, cheap plastic suitcases leaned against imported silk wallpaper. Their scuffed surfaces contrasted sharply with curated elegance. I shifted to the formal living room feed. Howard stood near the massive stone fireplace, holding a bottle of my rarest vintage scotch. His expression was naked avarice. He examined the label with widened eyes before breaking the wax seal without hesitation. He poured a heavy measure into one of my crystal tumblers. He did not glance around. He did not ask permission. He swallowed it, as if it were tap water. Cynthia paced across the Persian rug, her heels pressing into fibers hand-woven decades ago. Her fingers skimmed across the polished mahogany lid of my antique grand piano. She gestured toward the bay window's animated speculative. I increased the audio. Knock down that wall, she was saying. Open the space. Modern buyers love that. Increase resale value. Resale value. They were already redesigning the house in their minds, already calculating liquidation strategies. They were not caretakers. They were scavengers, cataloging inventory. From the kitchen feed, I observed Trenton moving with calculated authority. He opened cabinets, inspected drawers, tested locks. He believed he was conducting oversight. In reality, he was providing evidence. Every word, every gesture, every unauthorized action. Time-stamped, archived, encrypted. They believed I was upstairs deteriorating. They believed medication and legal documents had neutralized me. They believed they had forced entry into an aging man's declining world. Instead, they were actors on a stage they did not know existed. I leaned back in the chair tablet, balanced steadily in my hands. The blue glow reflected faintly in my eyes. The invasion had not weakened me. It had invited them into a controlled environment, and within that environment, their own behavior would dismantle them. They thought they were living inside my house. They were living inside my case file. I tapped the screen and isolated the audio feed from the living room. Cynthia's sharp nasal voice flooded the darkness of my bedroom, amplified with clinical precision. She was not whispering out of caution, she was whispering out of habit. There was no fear in her tone, only mockery. She laughed about my decline, ridiculing the tremor I had so carefully performed earlier that afternoon. She told Howard how easily Trenton had outmaneuvered me, how simple it had been to convince a judge that I was unstable. She spoke about my supposed dementia as if it were an amusing anecdote at a dinner party. Howard raised the crystal tumbler of my stolen scotch and offered a toast to my rapid deterioration. They clinked glasses to my imagined institutionalization. They spoke with the unfiltered cruelty of people who believe they are unobserved and invincible. They believed the house was theirs. They believed I was sedated, defeated, and irrelevant. They did not know that every word, every sneer, every contemptuous laugh, every careless confession was being captured in pristine, 4K resolution, encrypted in real time, and transmitted to a secure remote server controlled by Jonathan Pierce. I sat motionless in the darkness, watching them perform, for an audience they did not know existed. I felt no surge of anger, no flash of betrayal, only a cold architectural satisfaction. The invasion had not marked a loss. It had triggered the final stage of construction. The framework I had designed months earlier was now bearing weight exactly as intended. I leaned back in the leather armchair, the glow of the tablet reflecting faintly in my eyes. I was prepared to let them dig as deeply as they wished. Impunity breeds excess. Excess breeds error. The silent adjustment was unfolding with mechanical precision. That first night under my own roof as a supposed captive was profoundly instructive. I remained in my darkened suite, the oak door locked from the inside. Below me, footsteps echoed through the hallways. Drawers opened, doors creaked, cabinet hinges whispered. Howard and Cynthia had finished their celebratory drinks. Now they were hunting. I shifted the display to the main corridor leading toward my private library. The night vision lenses rendered their figures in sharp monochrome detail. They moved with deliberate caution, whispering as they tested brass handles and surveyed the layout. They believed I was asleep. They believed medication had dulled my senses. They believed the house was unguarded. Cynthia pushed open the heavy double doors to the library. Howard followed closely behind his gaze, sweeping across floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves, lined with rare first editions and archival volumes. They did not glance twice at the books. They were not searching for knowledge. They were searching for liquidity. The camera zoomed seamlessly, capturing Cynthia as she approached my antique writing desk. She began opening drawers methodically, then more aggressively scattering personal documents onto the Persian rug without regard. Her movements became frantic. Then she inhaled sharply. In the bottom drawer rested a velvet presentation case. Inside lay my grandfather's gold pocket watch, solid heavy, engraved with our family crest. It had survived 2 wars and 3 generations. Cynthia did not hesitate. She lifted the watch into the light, studying its weight and craftsmanship, not with reverence, but with valuation. She whispered to Howard that the gold casing alone would command thousands. She mentioned a private broker downtown who asked no questions. She slipped the watch into the deep pocket of her cardigan. A century of lineage disappeared into cotton fabric. Howard, meanwhile, had found the locked glass display case containing my collection of rare silver coins. He did not waste time searching for a key. He seized a bronze paperweight from the desk and pried at the delicate lock with calculated pressure. The glass yielded. He scooped handfuls of coins into a canvas tote he had brought deliberately downstairs. Each metallic clink echoed softly in the room. Every theft was recorded, every whisper archived. They were not cautious enough. They were comfortable. Once the library was stripped of portable value, they transitioned to the formal dining room. I switched the feed to the camera, concealed within the crystal chandelier above the long oak table. They sat beneath it like monarchs dividing tribute. Cynthia emptied her cardigan pocket, placing the gold watch among the silver coins. The gleam of the metal reflected in her eyes. She leaned forward and outlined their broader plan. This was only the beginning, she said. Trenton had assured them the temporary conservatorship would soon become permanent. Within 2 weeks, she predicted a judge would sign the final order. I would be transferred to a state-funded facility on the least desirable side of the city. The cheaper the institution, she reasoned, the greater the remaining profit. Howard nodded enthusiastically and pulled a small notebook from his jacket. He began calculating. He estimated the market value of the estate, the resale value of the antique furniture, the potential liquidation of artwork and collectibles. He speculated about the balance of the frozen checking accounts. Once I was secured, they would negotiate a percentage with Trenton Compensation, as they saw it, for assisting in the transition. They discussed my institutionalization with the tone of contractors reviewing renovation plans. No hesitation, no conscience. The microphone embedded above them captured every syllable with crystalline clarity. I listened as they plotted my confinement and financial erasure. The weakness I had portrayed earlier was nowhere within me now. What remained was something colder, more durable. Iron. I pressed the record icon, saving the full session to Jonathan's secure cloud repository. Redundant backups activated automatically. Timestamps. Authentication codes. Chain of custody documentation. The evidence was comprehensive. This was no longer a bitter family disagreement. It was a recorded conspiracy. Grand theft. Elder abuse. Fraudulent conservatorship. Because the estate was owned by a corporate trust, their theft constituted corporate larceny, a charge far more severe than petty domestic theft. They were not stealing from an old man. They were stealing from an entity protected by corporate law. And they were confessing as they did it. After cataloging their spoils, they extinguished the dining room lights and returned to their assigned guest suites. They moved through the house with the smug ease of people convinced of permanent control. They did not glance at ceilings. They did not suspect the molding. They did not question the air vents. I watched them retreat satisfied. Then I powered down the tablet. The room returned to darkness. I lay back on the bed, not seeking sleep, but stillness. The scavengers had entered the snare. Now I needed only one more miscalculation. Trenton would provide it. He always did. And when he did, the final piece would lock into place. The sun had barely risen when I opened the door to my master suite. A pale wash of morning light filtered through the high windows at the end of the hallway. The house was silent, profoundly, luxuriously silent. Howard and Cynthia, fatigued from a night of looting my library and celebrating with my finest liquor, were undoubtedly still asleep in the east wing, cocooned in linens they had not earned. I began my descent down the sweeping staircase, one deliberate step at a time. My hand gripped the polished banister, my shoulders curved inward, my gait slow and uneven. Even alone, I maintained the performance. A truly convincing illusion is never abandoned too early. If a door cracked open upstairs, if an eye watched from the shadows, they would see exactly what Trenton had described, to the court a fragile, diminished old man struggling with gravity and age. The marble foyer felt cool beneath my slippers. I crossed it without haste and unlocked the heavy front door, stepping into the crisp, clean air of early morning. The estate grounds were quiet. The oaks stood unmoving. Dew clung to the manicured grass, scarred the previous afternoon by Trenton's tires. My destination was the brick mailbox at the far end of the winding driveway. Trenton had instructed his in-laws to monitor my movements, but vigilance requires discipline, and scavengers by nature prefer ease over effort. Dawn is not their preferred hour. I walked slowly down the driveway, leaning slightly forward as though burdened by fatigue. When I reached the mailbox, I opened the iron door and sifted through the usual clutter: utility statements, glossy catalogs, unsolicited offers. Then I saw it. A thick priority envelope bearing the insignia of a prominent national commercial bank. It was addressed to Trenton Wallace. My home address was listed as his primary financial residence. The weight of the envelope felt substantial in my hand. I slid it quietly into the deep pocket of my robe and closed the mailbox with measured care. The return walk up the driveway was equally deliberate. My steps remained uneven, my breathing controlled. The illusion held. Inside, I secured the front door and climbed the staircase once more. Back in my master suite, I turned the deadbolt. The metallic click was soft but reassuring. I approached my mahogany desk and switched on the small brass reading lamp. Its warm pool of light cut through the dimness. I retrieved the envelope and opened it with a silver letter opener slicing cleanly along the sealed edge. I removed the contents and spread the documents across the leather writing surface. It was a formal notification of commercial loan approval and immediate disbursement. I scanned the pages, slowly absorbing each clause, each figure, each signature. A cold smile formed at the edge of my mouth. Trenton had moved quickly. The moment he secured temporary conservatorship authority, he had gone to a major financial institution and executed the plan he must have been contemplating for months. The bank had approved a $200,000 commercial line of credit. The funds had already been wired directly into the primary operating account of his logistics company. The desperation was transparent. His franchise had been hemorrhaging cash. Legal fees for Camille's felony defense were mounting. He needed liquidity immediately. But banks do not distribute $200,000 to a distressed enterprise without collateral. I turned to the second page. There it was, in bold type beneath the collateral description, the full legal address of my estate. Trenton had pledged my property as the sole security for the loan. He had presented the emergency conservatorship order as evidence of his authority. He had likely sat across from a complacent loan officer, displayed stamped court papers, and spoken confidently about asset control. He believed he had found a brilliant legal shortcut. In his mind, temporary authority over my personal affairs translated into unfettered power over real property. He imagined himself a strategist leveraging dormant capital to secure his failing empire. But he had misunderstood one critical fact. The conservatorship granted him authority over assets titled directly to Alistair Wallace the individual. The estate was not. 6 months earlier, the deed had been transferred into the ownership of Summit Corporate Holdings, a legally distinct corporate entity governed by an irrevocable blind trust. Alistair Wallace no longer owned the house. Trenton had pledged collateral he did not legally control. He had walked into a federally insured bank and signed documents encumbering property that belonged to a protected corporate trust. That was not a civil misunderstanding. That was bank fraud. By submitting false representations regarding asset ownership, he had intentionally misled a financial institution. By accepting an interstate electronic transfer of $200,000 under fraudulent pretenses, he had also triggered federal wire fraud statutes. These were not technicalities. They were prosecutable felonies, mandatory sentencing guidelines, federal jurisdiction, asset seizure. Trenton had escalated his misconduct from domestic manipulation to federal crime. He had constructed the trap himself, bolted it shut, and stepped inside. I leaned back in my chair and examined the signatures at the bottom of the agreement. His handwriting was bold, assured. He had believed he was securing salvation. Instead, he had authored his own indictment. There would be no plausible deniability. The loan documentation explicitly referenced the property address. The conservatorship order attached to the application did not confer real estate authority. Any competent forensic review would identify the discrepancy immediately. He had lied, and he had done so in writing. I reached for my encrypted tablet and activated the high-resolution camera function. Carefully, methodically, I photographed each page of the loan package. Every figure was captured in sharp clarity. The signatures were legible, the collateral description unmistakable. I ensured the metadata recorded time and location. I encrypted the image files and attached them to a secure transmission addressed to Jonathan Pierce. My message was brief. The fraud is complete. Initiate federal referral. I pressed send. The files transmitted through multiple layers of encryption to Jonathan's secured server. From there, they would move quietly and lawfully into the appropriate channels. This was no longer a matter for probate court maneuvering or civil dispute. This was a federal investigation waiting to be opened. Trenton had believed he was leveraging my estate to preserve his crumbling enterprise. Instead, he had leveraged himself. He thought he was buying time. He had purchased prison. I powered down the tablet and sat in the quiet glow of the reading lamp. Upstairs, beyond thick walls and locked doors, Howard and Cynthia still slept. Trenton likely believed the loan funds were stabilizing his company at that very moment. None of them understood what had already begun. The evidence was documented, the conspiracy recorded, the fraud executed, and now the next move belonged not to me, but to the federal government. I turned off the brass reading lamp and allowed the room to fall into shadow. The dull ache in my stitched cheek had faded into numbness. Pain had been replaced by clarity, cold surgical certainty. Downstairs, the scavengers would soon awaken, ready to resume their looting and rehearse their plans for my institutional burial. They had no idea that their future was already collapsing beneath them, legally, irrevocably, and with precision. Just before noon, I slipped from the house without ceremony. I avoided the heavy front entrance and exited through the rear conservatory, moving silently along the tiled floor. Beyond the glass, Howard and Cynthia sat on the patio furniture, issuing sharp instructions to my landscaper about the rose bushes as if they owned the soil. They were loud, entitled, intoxicated by proximity to wealth that was never theirs. The gardener nodded politely, enduring their demands. They barked orders at a man whose salary came from me. I followed the narrow gravel path that led to the discreet service gate at the back of the property. An unmarked black sedan idled quietly beyond the hedge. My driver stepped out only briefly to open the rear door. Once inside, I straightened my spine. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored charcoal suit and loosened the posture of frailty I had worn since the conservatorship order. The broken old man vanished. I was no longer prey inside my own walls. I was the strategist en route to the command center. Financial district, I instructed. The private elevator opened directly into Jonathan Pierce's secured conference suite, a room designed not for discussion, but for dismantling. It was windowless and soundproof, dominated by a long, black granite table and a wall of digital displays. Jonathan stood near the head of the table. Beside him was a man I did not recognize, lean, sharply dressed with eyes that scanned like a forensic instrument. Vincent, Jonathan said. Forensic accounting. Vincent offered no pleasantries, only a measured nod. His attention was already fixed on the screens. The war room was active. Jonathan tapped a remote, and the largest monitor illuminated with high-definition footage from my home. The library appeared in crisp detail. Cynthia rummaged through drawers. Howard pried open the coin cabinet. The gold pocket watch glinted beneath the lamp as it disappeared into her cardigan pocket. We watched without commentary. Vincent's fingers moved rapidly across his keyboard, cross-referencing inventory manifests from the trust's insurance registry. Market values populated the side panel: gold weight coin, rarity estimated resale value. Felony grand larceny threshold exceeded, he said evenly. Jonathan printed still images of their faces, frozen mid-theft, illuminated by the stolen silver. He slid the photographs into a thick red folder. They were no longer arrogant interlopers. They were defendants. The second monitor displayed court records from Camille's arraignment. Jonathan highlighted specific language in the bail order. Because the charge was a violent felony against an elderly family member, the court had imposed strict release conditions. A mandatory restraining order prohibited Camille from approaching within 100 feet of me or engaging in any threatening conduct. Any violation would trigger immediate revocation of bail. No warnings, no fines, immediate incarceration. Jonathan printed the conditions and added them to the folder. Camille stood unknowingly on a pressure plate. The third monitor displayed the loan documentation I had intercepted that morning. Vincent enlarged the relevant sections. Here was the collateral clause. Here was the estate address. Here was Trenton's signature. Vincent spoke without emotion as he explained the implications. Trenton had pledged property he did not own. He had misrepresented asset authority to a federally insured bank. He had authorized an interstate electronic transfer of $200,000 under false pretenses. That's wire fraud, Vincent said. Bank fraud as well. Federal jurisdiction. He printed the loan agreement, the conservatorship attachment, and the wire confirmation receipt. Each page was stamped and cataloged. Jonathan arranged the evidence methodically on the granite surface. First, documented theft by Howard and Cynthia. Second, Camille's restrictive bail conditions. Third, Trenton's federal financial crimes. He assembled the documents into a heavy leather binder. This was not a defensive case. It was an indictment waiting for delivery. Jonathan closed the binder and looked at me. "We can initiate arrests immediately," he said. "Your decision." I placed both hands on the granite table. "I don't want quiet arrests," I replied. I wanted accountability visible. I wanted Trenton to experience the same public humiliation he had engineered for me. I wanted Camille's illusion of social superiority shattered in full view. "We wait," I said. "Coordinate with local deputies and federal agents. We move when he provides an audience." Jonathan nodded. Understood. The binder was secured. The machinery was primed. I returned to the estate under the cover of early evening. I re-entered through the rear path and slipped upstairs unnoticed. The master suite door locked behind me once again, restoring the illusion of captivity. The house felt subdued. Howard and Cynthia had likely exhausted themselves cataloging my possessions and retired to their appropriated guest rooms. I placed the leather binder inside the hidden floor, safe beneath my wardrobe. The evidence rested inches below the floorboards, complete, irrefutable, patient. It did not take long. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside my door, measured, confident, theatrical. They stopped directly in front of the suite. There was a faint rustle of glossy paper. Something slid beneath the door, coming to rest near my shoes. I did not bend to retrieve it immediately. Trenton leaned close to the door. He did not knock. His voice filtered through the wood in a low, deliberate whisper, sharpened with cruelty. "Take a look," he said. He informed me that he had spent the afternoon touring my new home. He described the facility with relish. A state-funded institution at the industrial edge of the county, adjacent to a water treatment plant. He laughed as he recounted the chemical odor lingering in the corridors. Shared rooms, understaffed nurses, processed meals. He described my assigned roommate, a non-verbal man who screamed at walls through the night. His tone carried satisfaction. This was not concealment. It was punishment. He reminded me that Camille's preliminary hearing was approaching. By then he assured me the conservatorship would be permanent. Once he controlled my legal voice, he intended to withdraw my police statement. He would tell the court my memory was unreliable, that the assault had been a hallucination, that I had injured myself in confusion. He believed he could erase her charges by erasing my credibility. He boasted about retaining the most expensive defense attorney in the city, secured with the $200,000 he had borrowed against my property. Through the locked door, he detailed his triumph. He did not realize he was confessing. He believed I lacked the intelligence to understand the legal ramifications of his own words. He believed the broken man inside the room was powerless. I remained silent. I let him finish. When his footsteps finally retreated down the hallway, I bent and picked up the brochure. The glossy image showed a sterile facility bathed in fluorescent light. I placed it on the desk without reaction. Behind the locked door, I stood upright once more. The rope he believed he had tightened around my neck was already looped around his own, and the stage he was building for my humiliation would soon become the setting for his undoing. He told me to pack a single small suitcase because the state facility did not allow personal furniture or large wardrobes. He said he was bringing a moving crew in 3 days to clear out my bedroom and begin staging the house for a rapid commercial sale. He imagined out loud how much money the estate would fetch on the open market and how perfectly that cash would fund his failing logistics company. He ended his monologue by telling me that this was the absolute consequence of my selfishness. He said that if I had simply allowed his bankrupt in-laws to move in peacefully, none of this would have happened. He walked away down the hallway, his footsteps heavy with unearned victory. I waited until the sound of his footsteps completely faded before I bent down and picked up the glossy brochure. The cheap paper depicted a depressing gray brick building surrounded by a tall chain-link fence. The printed slogan promised basic essential care for the elderly. I walked over to my desk and turned on the small brass lamp. I did not feel fear or despair, as I looked at the miserable future my son had planned for me. I felt the profound, icy satisfaction of a man holding a winning lottery ticket. Trenton had just confirmed his entire criminal timeline. He had admitted his plan to obstruct justice in a federal proceeding by falsifying medical records to manipulate a violent felony trial. I placed the brochure carefully on my desk, right next to my encrypted tablet. I tapped the screen opening the secure communication channel to Jonathan Pierce. I sent a single text message outlining the strict 3-day deadline Trenton had just established. The real estate staging and the final celebration of his perceived triumph would be the absolute perfect venue for his destruction. I instructed Jonathan to finalize the guest list for our counter-ambush. Trenton wanted to sell my house and lock me in a state asylum. Instead, he had just booked himself a permanent suite in a federal penitentiary. The nursing home threat was not a weapon against me. It was the final nail he drove into his own coffin. The third day arrived exactly as my arrogant son had promised. By late afternoon, the tranquil silence of my private estate was violently shattered by a coordinated invasion. I stood by the second-floor window of my master suite, watching a fleet of commercial catering trucks and luxury event planners occupy my long, winding driveway. Men in crisp white uniforms carried massive exotic floral arrangements, crates of imported champagne, and heavy lighting equipment through my wide-open front doors. Trenton and Camille were sparing absolutely no expense. They were pulling out all the stops to celebrate their fabricated victory and cement their new status among the city elite. They had invited their entire social network, including wealthy, shallow friends, prominent business associates, and fellow members of their exclusive country club. They were hosting a grand high society housewarming party in a massive stone estate they did not own to celebrate a vast wealth they had systematically stolen. The heavy thumping of bass from a live band began to vibrate through the floorboards just as the sun began to set. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approached my bedroom door. The brass handle turned, but the solid oak remained firmly shut because my deadbolt was engaged. I walked over, unlocked the mechanism, and pulled the door open. Trenton stood in the hallway wearing a brand new bespoke tuxedo that fit him perfectly. He looked me up and down with an expression of profound, unvarnished disgust. He did not see a father. He saw a pathetic, embarrassing obstacle. He told me that his very important guests were beginning to arrive and that he could not risk a mentally unstable old man wandering downstairs and ruining the aesthetic of the evening. He ordered me to stay absolutely silent, to keep my television turned off, and to not even think about knocking on the door. He explicitly stated that if I caused any kind of scene or upset Camille during her special celebration, he would personally ensure my immediate physical transfer to the miserable state asylum before midnight. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive scotch, and told me to enjoy the sound of my betters enjoying my former life. Without waiting for a single word of response, he reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle, and forcefully pulled the door shut. A second later, I heard the unmistakable heavy metallic click of an exterior padlock sliding into a hastily installed latch. My own son had physically bolted me inside my bedroom. He had literally turned my private sanctuary into a locked holding cell, so he could parade around my elegant living room without the inconvenient reminder of the man he was currently destroying. I did not bang on the door. I did not raise my voice. Panic would have validated the narrative they had constructed about me. Instead, I turned away from the sealed oak barrier, crossed the room with measured calm, and took my seat behind the mahogany desk. I activated the encrypted tablet. 16 high-definition security feeds flared to life, at once casting a cold blue glow across the dark walls of my suite. The transformation of my own home was almost grotesque in its extravagance. Every shimmering surface below had been financed directly or indirectly through federal bank fraud and calculated deceit. The formal mahogany dining table, where my blood had dripped onto polished wood only days earlier, had been converted into a grotesque display of indulgence. Towering silver tiers overflowed with beluga caviar. Platters of raw oysters rested on crushed ice, sculpted into elegant swans. Crystal bowls reflected chandelier light like shards of ice. The same room that had witnessed violence now performed wealth. In the grand foyer, a live jazz quartet played soft, velvety melodies designed to elevate the illusion of refinement. Their music floated effortlessly over the loud, confident chatter of nearly 100 well-dressed guests. Laughter rose in waves. Champagne glasses clinked in celebration. I adjusted the main camera and centered the frame on Camille. She stood precisely where she believed she belonged, in the center of the formal living room, bathed in admiration. Her designer gown shimmered under chandelier light, cut flawlessly to project elegance and dominance. Diamond bracelets stacked heavily along her wrists caught the light with every theatrical gesture. Those diamonds, like the imported champagne in her glass, were the immediate fruits of the $200,000 loan Trenton had fraudulently secured against property he did not own. She radiated confidence. She laughed easily. She accepted compliments about the magnificent new home with rehearsed humility. There was not the slightest trace of anxiety in her posture, no hint of remorse for the violent felony hanging directly over her head. She believed the high-priced criminal defense attorney Trenton had retained had dissolved the threat of prison. In her mind, money had already rewritten reality. She moved as if untouchable. I shifted the audio feed toward the open bar. Howard and Cynthia were circulating through the crowd, with astonishing ease reinventing themselves as pillars of generational wealth. Cynthia wore my late wife's vintage pearl necklace, a priceless heirloom she had stolen from a locked vanity drawer on her first night in the house. It rested against her collarbone, as if it had always belonged there. She spoke animatedly to a group of local politicians outlining elaborate plans to modernize the estate. She described tearing down walls, replacing original woodwork, converting history into resale value. Howard stood nearby, distributing premium cigars from my private humidor, as though he were hosting the celebration himself. He boasted loudly about real estate ventures and market timing, exaggerating success that had never existed. The guests listened politely, unaware they were applauding a man already drowning in legal exposure. Watching them through high-definition surveillance was surreal. They moved with total conviction, smiling, networking, performing wealth. They were like passengers dancing on the polished deck of a luxury liner, already fatally compromised below the waterline. The hull had been breached. The flood had begun. Yet they toasted one another's brilliance while the cold, dark ocean crept upward unseen. The camera caught Trenton stepping close to Camille. He slid an arm around her waist and raised a crystal flute of imported champagne. He began to toast their limitless future voice, swelling with pride. The arrogance had reached its apex. Every predator in that room felt invincible. Every illusion was intact. The audience I required, judges, investors, politicians, donors, stood assembled beneath my chandelier, holding expensive drinks and listening closely. The stage was complete. All that remained was to lower the curtain. The season of patience had reached its final breath. The weeks of humiliation, observation, and strategic restraint had fulfilled their purpose. There would be no more waiting behind locked doors, no more playing the frail captive inside my own walls. It was time for the architect to emerge from the shadows and dismantle brick by fragile brick the paper kingdom they had constructed in my absence. Trenton truly believed that a $10 padlock purchased from a suburban hardware store had sealed my fate. I had heard the metallic scrape when he forced it through the exterior latch. I had listened to the self-satisfied rhythm of his footsteps retreating down the hallway, convinced he had neutralized the final obstacle to his control. To him, my silence meant surrender. My stillness meant collapse. He misunderstood everything. When I commissioned the design of this estate decades ago, I did not build a house. I built a fortress disguised as elegance. Every primary bedroom was fitted with commercial-grade fire safety overrides concealed within custom woodwork invisible to anyone not aware of their existence. The master suite door, heavy oak reinforced with internal steel bracing, was equipped with a hidden internal release mechanism engineered specifically to disengage external locking hardware in case of emergency. I approached the door without urgency. I traced my fingers along the smooth, carved molding until I located the subtle indentation hidden within the grain. To an untrained eye, it was nothing. To me, it was insurance. I pressed firmly. A muted mechanical click sounded within the wall cavity, precise and controlled. A second later, the exterior padlock released with a hollow metallic drop, striking the brass handle and swinging uselessly against it. The prison ceased to exist. I did not open the door. Freedom required preparation. I turned instead toward my cedar-lined walk-in closet. For months I had worn the costume of decline, oversized cardigans sagging at the shoulders, faded khaki trousers, orthopedic shoes intentionally scuffed. I had wrapped myself in the visual language of vulnerability, allowing their arrogance to swell unchecked. I had become the caricature they needed me to be. That uniform had served its purpose. I gripped the hangers and swept the fragile disguise from the rack. Knit fabric and worn cotton fell in a soft, defeated heap at my feet. The illusion lay discarded on polished hardwood. At the back of the closet, shielded behind garment bags and dust covers, waited the truth. I drew back the covers and revealed a bespoke three-piece charcoal suit, tailored in Milan, a structure of precision, cut from heavy wool. I selected a crisp white Egyptian cotton shirt and a deep crimson silk tie, whose color carried the quiet authority of blood and legacy. In the master bathroom, bright vanity lights ignited the marble counters. I washed my face, carefully avoiding the fresh black stitches that cut sharply across my right cheekbone. In the mirror stood not a broken widower, but a strategist reclaimed. I buttoned the white shirt, slowly fastening each pearl button, with hands that did not tremble. The tie formed a flawless Windsor knot beneath my chin. The vest settled against my torso, with reassuring weight. Finally, I slid my arms into the jacket and felt the structured shoulders align with my own. The suit was not attire. It was armor. For 4 decades I had negotiated hostile acquisitions, dismantled failing corporations, and constructed profitable empires wearing garments like this. Against shapeless sweaters, the bruising on my face had appeared tragic. Against the clean geometry of tailored wool, the scar resembled something else entirely, a mark earned in conflict and survived. A warning. I stepped into polished black leather Oxfords and adjusted my cuffs until precisely half an inch of white cotton extended beyond charcoal sleeves. Every detail mattered. The widower was gone. Alistair Wallace had returned. I opened the oak door. The broken padlock swung helplessly outside. I bypassed the grand staircase spectacle would grant Trenton time to perform. He thrived on narrative manipulation. Surprise would deny him that weapon. At the end of the corridor, I entered the narrow servant staircase concealed behind an unremarkable panel door. The wooden steps descended steeply, insulated from the main living areas. Designed for invisible movement, it offered exactly what I required. As I moved downward, the vibration of bass and brass filtered through the walls. The jazz quartet below played enthusiastically. Laughter rolled upward. 100 guests celebrated under chandeliers, raising glasses to my son's perceived triumph. Their noise cloaked my descent. At the bottom, I stepped into a shadowed service corridor behind the coat room. Marble gleamed faintly beyond the wall. I paused briefly, allowing timing to align. 8 o'clock precisely. I entered the vestibule. The massive front doors were closed, containing the noise of indulgence. Through frosted side panels, I observed silhouettes of vehicles gliding silently into the circular driveway. No sirens, no flashing lights. Containment required subtlety. I grasped the brass handles and pulled the doors wide. Cool night air flowed inward. On the porch stood Consequence. Jonathan Pierce occupied the center, immaculate in navy leather briefcase in hand. To his left, 2 county sheriff's deputies in dark tactical uniforms stood with disciplined stillness. To his right, a gray-suited federal agent wore a gold badge from the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI. Jonathan's gaze met mine, scanning suit scar posture. He nodded once. No words necessary. The trap was armed, the targets were inside, the exits were controlled. I stepped aside, holding the doors open. Justice crossed the threshold. The music continued for 3 seconds longer. Then it stopped. I moved through the foyer, past startled caterers clutching champagne trays toward the raised platform where the jazz quartet stood. Guests instinctively parted before me, conversation unraveling mid-sentence. I met the saxophonist's eyes and gave a single decisive shake of my head. Silence fell like a blade. Trenton emerged from the crowd, scotch in hand. Irritation flushed across his face. He strode toward me, unaware of the uniformed figures entering behind him. He accused me loudly of dementia, of instability, of embarrassing the family. Camille echoed his performance, suggesting medical transport, institutional care, protection from myself. He believed he commanded the room. I remained still. Then I stepped aside. Heavy tactical boots echoed across marble. Gasps rippled outward. Trenton's glass slipped from his hand and shattered. Jonathan introduced himself as counsel for Summit Commercial Holdings, the legal entity owning the estate. He declared the gathering concluded. Alcohol service halted. Musicians packed instruments. The property, he announced calmly, was now an active federal crime scene. Trenton attempted protest. Jonathan raised one hand. Silence. Deputies secured exits. The federal agent stepped forward. The kingdom dissolved. In that moment, beneath chandeliers and surveillance, surrounded by witnesses and consequence, the architect stepped fully into the light and the paper castle began to burn. I pushed open the towering double doors and stepped across the threshold of my own home. The shift from the cool, quiet night into the overheated chaos of the foyer was immediate and suffocating. Warm air heavy with perfume and roasted meat pressed against my lungs. Laughter echoed off marble and stone. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across polished floors. I did not pause. I moved forward with deliberate, unhurried steps, brushing past stunned catering staff, balancing silver trays of champagne. Their eyes flicked toward my scarred cheek and the sharp lines of my charcoal suit. But I offered them nothing, not acknowledgement, not reassurance. My gaze remained fixed on the live jazz quartet, performing in the corner of the grand living room. The saxophone wailed softly over brushed drums and upright bass. It was elegant, polished, manufactured joy. I crossed the marble floor, slowly, the echo of my footsteps cutting through the music like a blade. Conversations faltered as guests noticed me. Wealthy patrons instinctively shifted aside, forming a quiet corridor through the crowd. They took in the severity of my expression, the unflinching steadiness in my stride. I mounted the small raised platform where the musicians played. The saxophonist glanced up mid-phrase. I met his eyes and gave a single decisive shake of my head. He stopped instantly. The pianist's hands hovered above ivory keys before lowering. The bass player let the final vibration fade into nothing. Music vanished. The sudden silence was violent. An unnatural vacuum swallowed the room. Laughter collapsed into confused murmurs. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me. From the center of the crowd, the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns parted. Trenton emerged. He held a crystal tumbler of Scotch amber liquid sloshing near the rim. His face was flushed, alcohol and irritation mixing beneath his skin. He strode toward me, irritation sharpened by arrogance. His tuxedo jacket strained with his movement. He had not yet noticed the figures waiting in the shadows of the vestibule. He saw only me, the father he believed broken. He stopped 3 feet away, chest rising and falling with theatrical outrage. He raised his voice deliberately, projecting so every guest could hear. "What are you doing down here?" he demanded. His tone dripped with condescension. He asked if I had forgotten the rules. He accused me loudly and confidently of suffering from severe dementia. He declared that I was prone to unpredictable outbursts. He apologized to his guests in a voice thick with performative embarrassment. He painted himself as the exhausted, dutiful son, forced to manage a deteriorating parent. He insisted my condition had worsened, that I was unstable, dangerous. Camille slid into place beside him, diamond bracelets catching chandelier light. She crossed her arms and exhaled dramatically. "We tried," she said loudly. "We truly tried." She instructed Trenton publicly to call the private medical transport service. She announced that, for my own safety, I would need to be institutionalized immediately. The guests shifted uneasily. Trenton nodded with eagerness, stepping closer until I could smell the liquor on his breath. He ordered me to return to my room. He threatened to drag me upstairs if necessary. He called my presence an embarrassment, a burden. He smiled, cruel, assured, triumphant. He waited for me to lower my eyes, to retreat. I did not blink. I did not move. The silence thickened, amplifying every foolish word he had thrown into the air. Then I stepped aside, just once. The sound came first. Heavy synchronized footfalls striking marble. The rhythm of tactical boots echoed through the foyer. Gasps erupted around the room as 2 towering county sheriff's deputies emerged from the darkened vestibule into full light. They were not ceremonial officers. They wore dark green tactical uniforms, utility belts heavy with equipment. Their posture was rigid, deliberate. They moved past stunned guests and positioned themselves at the primary exit. Behind them walked a man in a gray suit. His presence was quieter, but no less commanding. A polished gold badge identifying him as a federal financial crimes agent gleamed at his belt. Trenton's smile disintegrated. Color drained from his face so quickly it was almost visible. His hand slackened. The crystal tumbler slipped from his grip and shattered against the marble expensive Scotch, bleeding across polished stone. Camille gasped sharply, instinctively retreating behind him. The room transformed. Elegant laughter turned into frantic whispers. Guests who, moments ago, had toasted Trenton's success now exchanged alarmed glances as the reality settled in. This was no misunderstanding. This was a raid. Jonathan Pierce entered last. He carried his leather briefcase with quiet certainty. He did not hurry. He did not raise his voice. He moved through the crowd with controlled authority, as if this exact moment had already been rehearsed in his mind. He walked past Trenton without acknowledgement and stopped beside me. He unbuttoned his navy suit jacket and faced the room. When he spoke, his voice was calm, resonant, and absolute. "My name is Jonathan Pierce," he began, "Senior Corporate Counsel for Summit Commercial Holdings." The name alone shifted the atmosphere. He informed the assembled guests that the estate they were currently standing in was owned not by Trenton Wallace, but by Summit Commercial Holdings, a separate legal entity. He announced that the gathering was officially concluded. He instructed the catering staff to cease alcohol service immediately. He directed the musicians to pack their instruments. The illusion of celebration collapsed in layers. Trenton opened his mouth to protest, to threaten to posture, but Jonathan lifted one hand. That single gesture silenced him more effectively than force. This property, Jonathan continued evenly, is now an active federal crime scene. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. "No one," he said, "is permitted to leave until initial arrests are completed." The words fell like iron bars. Trenton's kingdom evaporated in seconds. The deputies shifted subtly, reinforcing the exits. The federal agent stepped forward, expression unreadable. Camille's composure shattered. Her fingers tightened around Trenton's sleeve. The diamonds on her wrist trembled under chandelier light. The guests stood frozen between disbelief and fear. Jonathan's gaze settled on Trenton with clinical detachment. Control had shifted entirely. The power dynamic that Trenton had staged so theatrically moments earlier had inverted completely. The marble floors that once reflected champagne and laughter now reflected panic. The doors were no longer decorative. They were containment. The housewarming party had become something else entirely. The slaughterhouse doors were locked, and the butchers were ready to work. Before I reveal what was inside that briefcase, if you're still with me, comment the number 65 below, so I know you're standing right here with me. And just a quick note, the next part of this story includes dramatized elements for impact. Some details may not be entirely real. If that's not for you, this is your moment to step away. The silence inside the grand living room was suffocating, thick, electric, almost violent in its intensity. The live jazz quartet stood frozen near the baby grand piano, saxophone suspended mid-air drumsticks, hovering inches above taut skin. Nearly 100 impeccably dressed guests, bankers, judges, donors, socialites remained perfectly still. Champagne flutes paused halfway to parted lips. The room had been designed for applause and admiration, not reckoning. Yet reckoning had arrived. Jonathan Pierce did not hesitate. He moved with the controlled precision of a surgeon approaching a final incision. Without acknowledging the tension saturating the air, he crossed the marble floor toward the enormous 85-inch television mounted above the carved stone fireplace. From the inner pocket of his tailored navy suit, he withdrew a small matte black digital device no larger than a deck of cards. Calmly, methodically, he connected it to the auxiliary port beneath the screen. The television flickered. The dark, reflective surface shifted from silent black to a vivid, crystalline blue. Trenton stood in the center of the room, as if struck by invisible force. Fragments of his shattered crystal tumbler still glittered at his polished shoes. He blinked rapidly, struggling to comprehend what was unfolding. His voice cracked as he demanded to know what Pierce thought he was doing. Pierce did not grant him the courtesy of a reply. He tapped the illuminated screen of his encrypted tablet. Instantly, the towering television mirrored his display in flawless high definition. Across the room, near the lavish open bar stocked with imported scotch and rare cognac, Howard and Cynthia finally grasped the magnitude of their predicament. The confidence they had paraded all evening, their polished laughter, their exaggerated stories of strategic investments collapsed like wet plaster. Howard leaned toward his wife, whispering urgently, fingers digging into her forearm. They began edging sideways, inching toward the glass patio doors, attempting escape beneath the guise of discretion. They did not make it far. A uniformed sheriff's deputy, broad-shouldered, immovable, stepped smoothly into their path. His leather-gloved hand closed over the chrome handle of the door. He did not speak. He did not threaten. He simply shook his head once. There would be no vanishing into the night. They turned slowly, forced back toward the glowing screen dominating the room. Jonathan pressed play. The television dissolved from blue into darkness, then into grainy black and white clarity. Night vision footage illuminated the interior of my private library with ruthless precision. Gasps rippled across the audience as the shadowed figures of Howard and Cynthia appeared on screen, moving cautiously across my Persian rug like seasoned intruders. The surround sound activated. Every whisper was audible, every breath amplified. The guests watched in stunned silence as Cynthia approached my antique writing desk. On screen, her face glowed pale beneath infrared light eyes wide with manic delight. She yanked open the heavy drawer and leaned inside. The room filled with her voice, sharp nasal, unmistakable boasting about the value of what she had found. She lifted my grandfather's solid gold pocket watch, turning it beneath the lamp, as though appraising stolen merchandise in a back alley. Her recorded words echoed through the speaker's remarks about melting down the casing, about discreet pawnbrokers downtown who asked no questions. A murmur of horror passed through the party. The footage shifted seamlessly. Now Howard dominated the screen. Moments earlier, he had been holding court near the fireplace, lecturing local officials about property acquisition and market timing. On screen, however, he was something else entirely. The guests watched him seize a heavy bronze paperweight and drive its edge into the delicate lock of my glass display cabinet. The metallic crack of the breaking latch thundered through the silent room. The sound was brutal. He pried the cabinet open without hesitation. Silver coins spilled into his waiting hands, their dull gleam catching infrared light as he shoveled them into a cheap canvas tote. He chuckled under his breath, an ugly, greedy sound amplified mercilessly across the living room's premium sound system. A state senator near the front lowered his glass slowly. A prominent donor covered her mouth. There was no room for interpretation, no room for defense. The footage continued. Cynthia whispered about resale value. Howard calculated estimates aloud. Their conspiracy was not subtle, it was brazen. They spoke openly of selling heirlooms, of liquidating assets once I was properly relocated. The room felt colder. Trenton's face drained of color as the evidence unfolded in unforgiving clarity. He took a half-step backward, shaking his head as if denial alone might shatter the projection. Pierce remained perfectly composed, one hand resting lightly on the tablet as the footage advanced frame by frame. The library scene transitioned to the dining room. The camera angle changed to a hidden vantage point within the chandelier. Guests now watched Howard and Cynthia, seated at my formal table, spreading the stolen coins and gold across polished mahogany like pirates dividing treasure. They discussed future plans, renovations, resale strategies, profits. Once I was institutionalized, their voices were crisp, their greed unmistakable. The jazz band stood motionless instruments hanging uselessly at their sides. No one dared to breathe too loudly. In the far corner, two deputies subtly repositioned themselves. Howard's earlier laughter at the bar now seemed grotesque in memory. Cynthia's diamond earrings caught the television's reflected light as her recorded self gloated about my supposed decline. The illusion of wealth and sophistication that had wrapped this evening like silk was unraveling thread by thread. Jonathan finally paused the footage at a still frame, Howard's hand, mid-air silver coins spilling from his fingers. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize. The screen alone was indictment enough. In that suspended silence, reputations collapsed, masks shattered, the curated narrative of success dissolved under the glare of truth. And for the first time that evening, every guest in that grand living room understood exactly who the predators were. The public humiliation radiating through the room was palpable. The high society guests physically recoiled, shifting their weight away from Howard and Cynthia, as if the destitute in-laws carried a highly contagious, deadly disease. Pierce did not stop there. He tapped his tablet again, and the footage transitioned to the brilliant color video captured from the dining room chandelier. This was the absolute killing blow. It was one thing to be publicly exposed as a petty thief, but it was another thing entirely to be exposed as a heartless monster. The wealthy guests watched Howard and Cynthia sitting comfortably at my dining table, dividing their stolen plunder like pirates. The sensitive microphone picked up Cynthia's cruel, mocking laughter perfectly. Her voice filled the crowded room, explicitly detailing their grand strategy to lock me away in a miserable, underfunded state facility. She bragged loudly to Howard about how Trenton was going to forcefully sell my estate and use the money to fund their luxury retirement while I rotted away in a cramped shared bedroom next to the water treatment plant. The wealthy crowd was deeply, profoundly disturbed. These were people who valued reputation and social standing above absolutely everything else in the world. They were currently watching a raw, unedited display of pure human rot. A prominent city councilwoman, who had been graciously complimenting Cynthia's vintage pearl necklace just moments before, loudly expressed her absolute disgust. Cynthia instinctively reached up and covered the stolen pearls resting against her collarbone, her face flushing a deep, humiliating crimson. Howard simply stared at the marble floor, his entire body trembling violently, unable to meet the eyes of the prominent men he had been desperately trying to impress all evening. They were completely stripped of their false dignity. They were utterly exposed as destitute scavengers who had attempted to feed off an old man they incorrectly assumed was defenseless. Camille watched the screen with her mouth hanging open in pure horror. She looked at her parents and then looked at the disgusted faces of her wealthy friends. The high society life she had violently clawed her way into was disintegrating before her very eyes. Pierce paused the video, freezing the massive screen on an incredibly unflattering image of Howard grinning greedily over his stolen silver coins. Pierce turned his body slowly to face the two sheriff deputies standing by the patio doors. He stated in a clear, highly professional tone that the two individuals currently cowering by the exit had committed documented felony grand larceny. He informed the deputies in front of the entire silent room that the stolen solid gold pocket watch was currently residing in the right pocket of Howard's suit jacket. He added that the stolen vintage pearl necklace was currently clasped tightly around Cynthia's neck. Pierce officially requested acting as the senior legal representative of the corporate trust that owned the property and the stolen items, that the deputies immediately recover the stolen goods and execute a formal arrest. The trap had sprung flawlessly, completely destroying their reputations before the handcuffs even left the belts of the officers. The two sheriff deputies moved with practiced efficiency. They escorted the weeping Cynthia and the trembling Howard toward the vestibule, stripping them of their stolen dignity and the stolen jewelry right in front of the stunned crowd. With the scavengers removed, the oppressive silence in the living room focused entirely on my son. Trenton stood alone in the center of his ruined celebration. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously above his crimson bow tie. He attempted to salvage the unsalvageable. He forced a pathetic, nervous laugh and addressed the wealthy guests, claiming he had absolutely no idea his in-laws were capable of such horrific behavior. He tried to physically distance himself from their crimes, stepping away from his wife and looking directly at Jonathan Pierce. He puffed out his chest and tried to assert the fake authority he believed he still possessed. He told Pierce that while he appreciated the security intervention, the lawyer was wildly out of line for crashing a private event. Trenton loudly reminded everyone that he held a court-ordered emergency conservatorship. He declared that he was the legal master of the estate and demanded that Pierce and the remaining federal agent leave his property immediately. Pierce did not flinch. He did not raise his voice to match Trenton. He simply placed his heavy leather briefcase flat onto the nearest marble side table and unlatched the brass locks. The sharp click echoed across the silent room. Pierce withdrew a thick stack of crisp legal documents bound by a heavy blue seal. He walked slowly toward Trenton, holding the papers out for the entire room to see. Pierce stated in his freezing, authoritative tone that Trenton was operating under a massive, profound delusion. He explained that the emergency conservatorship only granted temporary authority over the personal assets of Alistair Wallace, the individual. Pierce paused, letting the absolute silence amplify his next sentence. He announced that Alistair Wallace, the individual, had not owned this property for over 6 months. Trenton blinked rapidly, his arrogant expression faltering, as his brain struggled to process the legal terminology. Pierce handed the top document directly to Trenton. It was the master deed of the estate. Pierce instructed him to read the name of the legal owner, printed in bold black ink. Trenton looked down at the paper, his hands beginning to shake violently. He read the words, Summit Commercial Holdings. Pierce explained to the captivated audience that the estate, the antique furniture, and every single blade of grass on the property belonged to an irrevocable corporate blind trust. Trenton was holding a meaningless piece of paper. He had assumed absolute control over an empty vault. The realization hit Trenton like a physical blow, but Pierce was not finished. The destruction of my son required absolute total finality. Pierce reached back into his briefcase and retrieved a second highly encrypted document. It was the commercial loan agreement I had intercepted from the mailbox that very morning. Pierce held the loan document up beside the corporate trust deed. He asked Trenton if he remembered walking into a federally insured bank 3 days ago. He asked if he remembered signing a legally binding contract to secure a massive line of credit for his failing logistics franchise. Trenton opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him the color of dirty ash. He took a staggering step backward, bumping into the grand piano. Pierce did not let him breathe. He read the exact terms of the loan allowed to the silent room. He stated that Trenton had accepted an electronic transfer of $200,000. He then read the collateral agreement where Trenton had explicitly pledged my private estate as the sole guarantee for the massive sum. Pierce lowered the papers and looked Trenton dead in the eyes. He stated with brutal clarity that pledging a corporate asset you do not own and have absolutely no legal authority to encumber is not a simple misunderstanding. It is a severe premeditated federal crime. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. The wealthy business owners and local politicians immediately understood the catastrophic magnitude of the accusation. Bank fraud was an unforgivable sin in their circles. They began backing away from Trenton as if the marble floor beneath his feet was suddenly collapsing. The federal agent in the gray suit finally stepped forward. He moved with the heavy, inevitable weight of the United States government. He bypassed Pierce and walked directly up to my son. The agent did not offer a polite greeting. He looked at Trenton with absolute professional contempt. He stated his name and his agency, identifying himself as a senior investigator for the Financial Crimes Division. The agent announced that he was executing an immediate arrest warrant for massive bank fraud, wire fraud, and the fabrication of federal loan documents. Trenton completely collapsed inward. The wealthy, successful businessman facade shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. He dropped the legal documents onto the floor and raised his hands in a frantic pleading gesture. He looked past the federal agent directly at me. He begged me to tell them it was a mistake. He pleaded with me to pay off the bank loan and make the federal agent go away. He called me, his father tears streaming down his face, completely forgetting the miserable nursing home brochure he had shoved under my door just hours earlier. I looked at him, my face completely devoid of any emotion. I told him that I was simply a sick, paranoid old man, and that I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. I gave him back the exact cold indifference he had shown me when my face was bleeding at his dining table. The federal agent grabbed Trenton roughly by the shoulder, spinning him around. The agent kicked Trenton's legs apart, forcing him into a humiliating spread-eagle stance right in the middle of his own lavish party. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed through the grand living room. The bespoke tuxedo jacket stretched awkwardly, pinning his arms painfully behind his back. The federal agent began reading Trenton his Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice, completely drowning out his pathetic sobbing. The high society guests watched in absolute stunned silence as the golden boy of their country club was physically restrained like a common violent criminal. His logistics company was dead. His reputation was permanently eradicated. His future was confined to a federal prison cell. The trap had closed perfectly around his neck. The heavy steel handcuffs securing my son were the final brutal reality check for the high society crowd. But my work in that grand living room was still not completely finished. Trenton was standing with his head bowed, his bespoke tuxedo twisted awkwardly around his restrained arms, weeping openly as the federal agent read him his rights. The guests were completely silent, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the legal destruction happening right in front of the catering tables. I turned my back on my sobbing son and shifted my focus entirely to my daughter-in-law. Camille was standing near the towering floral arrangements, her face pale and her eyes wide with frantic terror. She was watching her husband, the supposedly brilliant entrepreneur, being processed as a federal criminal. She slowly realized that without his fabricated income, her entire luxurious lifestyle was actively evaporating into thin air. She looked at me, hoping to find a shred of the weak, compliant old man she had bullied for years. She found only the cold, unyielding stare of the architect who had engineered her absolute ruin. I walked slowly across the polished marble floor, closing the distance between us. The crowd parted instinctively, giving me a wide, unobstructed path to the woman who had violently scarred my face just 3 days earlier. I reached inside the breast pocket of my charcoal suit and withdrew the crisp-sealed envelope Jonathan Pierce had prepared for me. I held it in my right hand, feeling the heavy premium paper. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from her, standing outside the physical boundary mandated by her strict bail conditions. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute silence of the room ensured that every single wealthy guest heard my words perfectly. I asked Camille if she truly believed her husband was a self-made millionaire. I asked her if she honestly thought the failing logistics franchise he ran could actually afford the diamond bracelet she was currently wearing, or the luxury sports cars sitting in my driveway. Camille stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She could not comprehend why I was asking her about their finances while her husband was in handcuffs. I did not wait for her to formulate a pathetic lie. I turned slightly so the captive audience could hear the final devastating truth. I announced that 5 years ago, I had quietly purchased the massive commercial warehouse complex that housed Trenton's entire operation. I revealed that I was the anonymous corporate landlord operating entirely behind the walls of Summit Commercial Management. I explained to the shocked crowd of local politicians and business owners that the actual market rent for that massive facility was $40,000 a month, but I had secretly allowed my son to pay only $8,000. I stated clearly that every single month for half a decade, I had personally subsidized their arrogant, lavish lifestyle to the tune of $32,000. I told Camille that she was not a high society queen. She was the unknowing recipient of my silent, exhausting charity. The absolute humiliation hit Camille with the force of a physical blow. The wealthy friends she had desperately tried to impress were now staring at her with profound, unvarnished pity and disgust. The illusion of her superiority was completely permanently shattered. I held out the heavy sealed envelope and dropped it onto the marble floor directly at her expensive designer heels. I told her that the envelope contained the immediate and absolute termination of the commercial warehouse lease. I explained the strict morality clause buried deep within the contract her foolish husband had signed. I stated that, because she had violently assaulted the primary shareholder of the management company and was subsequently arrested for a felony, the lease was legally voided. I informed her that the warehouse doors were currently being padlocked by private security. Their logistics company was instantly completely bankrupt. They had absolutely no assets, no income, and nowhere to go. Camille looked down at the white envelope resting on the floor. Her mind could not process the absolute totality of her destruction. Within the span of 10 minutes, she had lost her wealthy parents to grand larceny charges, her husband to federal bank fraud, and her entire financial foundation to a single piece of paper. The psychological break was instantaneous and violent. The sheer magnitude of her public humiliation overrode every single instinct of self-preservation she possessed. She forgot the crowded room. She forgot the federal agent. Most importantly, she completely forgot the strict mandatory conditions of her felony bail release. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged, demonic rage. She let out a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream that echoed violently off the high ceilings of the estate. She lunged forward, her manicured hands hooked like claws, aiming directly for the fresh stitches on my face. She intended to tear my eyes out right in front of 100 witnesses. She did not even make it 2 feet. The 2 towering county sheriff deputies who had just finished escorting her parents outside had re-entered the grand foyer. They reacted with terrifying speed and absolute overwhelming force. Before Camille could even brush the fabric of my suit, one deputy hit her from the side, tackling her violently to the hard marble floor. The impact was sickeningly loud. The crystal champagne flutes on the nearby tables rattled violently. Her expensive designer gown tore instantly, and the heavy diamond bracelets she had paraded around all evening snapped, sending loose diamonds scattering across the polished stone. The second deputy dropped his heavy knee squarely onto her back, pinning her firmly against the floor. He grabbed her wrists and twisted them painfully behind her back, pulling out a fresh pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic ratcheting sound echoed for the second time that night. The deputy leaned down, placing his face inches from her ear. He announced in a booming voice that she was under immediate arrest for the blatant violation of her felony bail conditions and for attempting to assault a protected victim. He stated that her bail was permanently revoked, and she would be transported directly to the maximum security county jail to await her trial behind bars. Camille thrashed wildly against the marble floor, screaming obscenities and crying hysterically, completely ruining her expensive makeup and her fragile high society reputation. She was dragged to her feet by the 2 massive officers, her dress ruined, her dignity gone, and her freedom permanently erased. I stood perfectly still, adjusting the cuffs of my bespoke suit, watching the deputies drag my violently screaming daughter-in-law out the front doors and into the cold, dark night. The eviction was complete, and the poison was finally purged from my home. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the high ceilings of my grand foyer. I stood perfectly still, watching the heavy vehicles back out of my winding driveway and disappear into the dark night, carrying my son and daughter-in-law toward their new reality. The luxurious housewarming party had completely evaporated. The wealthy guests had fled the moment the federal agent produced his handcuffs, leaving behind half-eaten plates of caviar and shattered glass. The live jazz band had packed their instruments and vanished through the service exit. The only people remaining in the vast, silent living room were Jonathan Pierce, myself, and the two terrified scavengers who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. I turned away from the open front doors and locked my eyes onto Howard and Cynthia. They were huddled together near the cold stone fireplace, trembling like frightened mice caught in the glaring light of a trap. Their stolen confidence had been entirely stripped away. Cynthia was clutching the collar of her cheap cardigan, where my late wife's vintage pearl necklace used to rest. Howard was staring at the marble floor, his hands empty and shaking. They had watched their daughter dragged away screaming, and their son-in-law arrested for federal bank fraud. They knew with absolute certainty that they were standing at the edge of their own total destruction. I walked slowly toward them, my leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished stone. I stopped just a few feet away, allowing my imposing presence in the bespoke suit to completely dominate their shrinking figures. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, calculated precision of a judge delivering a final sentence. I told them that the solid gold pocket watch and the silver coins they had attempted to steal belonged to a corporate trust insured for millions of dollars. I explained that stealing from that trust constituted a massive felony carrying a mandatory state prison sentence for grand larceny. Cynthia began to sob, a pathetic high-pitched sound of pure desperation. She opened her mouth to beg for forgiveness, to claim it was all a terrible misunderstanding. I raised a single finger, silencing her instantly. I told her that I had absolutely no interest in her tears or her pathetic excuses. I raised my left arm and pulled back the crisp white cuff of my shirt, exposing the face of my luxury watch. I told them they had exactly 10 minutes. I instructed them to walk up the stairs to their luxurious guest suites and pack only the cheap plastic suitcases they had dragged into my home. I stated clearly that if they attempted to take a single towel, a single piece of silver, or a single bottle of wine, the sheriff deputies waiting at the end of the driveway would be summoned immediately. I promised them that if they were still standing inside my home when the minute hand struck the quarter hour, I would personally hand the high-definition surveillance footage to the district attorney. And I dropped my arm and pointed toward the grand staircase. The 10-minute warning had begun. They did not hesitate. They scrambled toward the stairs, tripping over each other in their desperate, frantic rush to escape the slaughterhouse they had helped build. 6 months passed with the quiet, inevitable speed of a turning season. The grand living room of my estate had long been cleaned of the shattered glass and the lingering smell of expensive champagne. Today, the walls surrounding my family were not made of carved stone and silk wallpaper. They were made of thick concrete and bulletproof glass inside the federal courthouse located downtown. I sat perfectly still in the back row of the gallery, wearing my heavy charcoal suit. The air in the courtroom was incredibly sterile and cold. There were no caterers serving caviar, and no jazz bands playing soft music to mask the tension. There was only the heavy absolute reality of the legal system preparing to crush the arrogance of my son and his wife. The silent adjustment I had set into motion half a year ago was finally reaching its ultimate legal conclusion. Camille was brought into the courtroom first. The physical transformation was absolute and devastating to witness. The stunning high society queen who had paraded around my home in a designer gown and stolen diamonds was entirely gone. She was wearing a loose-fitting bright orange state-issued jumpsuit. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her face was devoid of the expensive makeup she used to project her superiority. She stood before the state judge, her shoulders slumped forward. The judge did not care about her previous social standing or her wealthy country club friends. He looked down from his high wooden bench and read her final sentence with absolute mechanical precision. He explicitly cited the traumatic nature of her unprovoked physical assault upon an elderly family member. He then highlighted her profound arrogance in violating the mandatory bail conditions right in front of federal law enforcement officers. For these blatant criminal acts, Camille was sentenced to 3 full years in the state penitentiary. She did not scream or fight this time. Her spirit was completely broken. She simply closed her eyes as the heavy metal cuffs were locked around her wrists once again. The deputies led her away through a heavy, secure side door, erasing her from polite society entirely. Trenton was escorted into the federal courtroom an hour later. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant entrepreneur who had tried to lock me away in a miserable asylum. His skin was pale, and he had lost a significant amount of weight during his time in the county holding facility. He stood before the federal magistrate, staring down at the polished wooden defense table. The federal prosecutor laid out the undeniable facts of the case, presenting the fraudulent medical injunction and the forged commercial loan documents. The federal judge addressed Trenton directly, stating that his crimes were an act of profound, calculated malice against his own father. The judge emphasized that pledging a corporate asset he did not own was a direct attack on the integrity of the federal banking system. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a loud cracking sound. Trenton was sentenced to 5 years in a federal correctional facility. There was no leniency offered and absolutely no option for early parole. Just before the federal marshals pulled him away, he turned around and looked directly at me. He was desperately searching for a single ounce of sympathy or regret in my eyes. I gave him absolutely nothing. I simply held his gaze until he was forced to turn away and walk through the secure door to begin his half-decade of concrete isolation. I walked out of the massive courthouse and stepped into the warm afternoon sun. Jonathan Pierce was waiting for me on the wide stone steps, holding a final legal dossier. He handed me a single sheet of paper detailing the final fate of Howard and Cynthia. They had narrowly avoided a state prison sentence by agreeing to a massive financial restitution plan for the grand larceny charges. The aggressive repayment schedule ordered by the court had instantly and completely bankrupted them. The prominent local politicians and wealthy friends they had tried so hard to impress had permanently blacklisted them from their social circles. They were now living in a dilapidated, rusted trailer located in a miserable, dusty park on the absolute farthest edge of the county. They were completely destitute, surviving on meager government rations and turning entirely against each other in their shared misery. The scavengers had finally run out of things to steal and were left with nothing but the bitter consequences of their own boundless greed. A week after the sentencing, I drove out to the industrial edge of the city. I parked my car in front of the massive commercial warehouse complex that had once housed my son and his failing logistics franchise. The enormous metal roll-up doors were securely locked, and the expansive loading docks were completely empty. The fleet of leased delivery trucks and the arrogant employees were all gone, liquidated by the bankruptcy courts months ago. I unlocked the side access door and stepped inside the cavernous space. The silence echoing off the high steel rafters was deeply satisfying. For 5 years, this building had been a monument to my silent charity and a breeding ground for my son and his profound entitlement. Every square foot of this concrete floor represented money I had quietly sacrificed to keep his fragile ego intact. Now the space was completely stripped bare, swept clean of his lies and his monumental failures. The poison had been physically removed from the property, but I needed to completely purge it from my financial empire. Jonathan Pierce arrived a few minutes later, accompanied by 3 executives from a national distribution conglomerate. They were not looking for a discounted family favor. They were aggressively seeking prime industrial real estate, and they were willing to pay the absolute maximum market price to acquire it. We did not conduct the transaction in a formal boardroom. We stood right there on the cold concrete floor of the empty warehouse, using a heavy wooden shipping crate as a makeshift desk. The executives handed Jonathan the final purchase agreement. I read through the terms confirming the massive multi-million-dollar purchase price. I took a silver pen from my jacket pocket and signed my name on the bottom line. I officially transferred the ownership of the building, severing my final physical tie to the location of my son and his ultimate betrayal. The bank confirmation arrived on my encrypted tablet before the executives even drove out of the parking lot. The massive sum of money had been wired directly into the primary holding account of Summit Commercial Management. I looked at the glowing numbers on the screen. It was a staggering amount of capital, but I felt absolutely no desire to reinvest it or add it to my personal wealth. That money felt heavy and deeply tainted. It was the physical manifestation of the abuse I had suffered and the family I had been forced to destroy. I could not simply fold those funds back into my pristine corporate ledgers. I needed to weaponize that capital one final time, but not for revenge. I needed to use it for absolute restoration. I left the industrial park and drove directly back into the heart of the city. I navigated through the busy downtown streets until I reached a modest brick office building. This was the headquarters of a prominent non-profit legal foundation dedicated entirely to protecting vulnerable elderly citizens from financial exploitation and physical abuse. I walked into the reception area and asked to speak directly with the executive director. I was led into a small practical office filled with active case files. The director was a weary but fiercely dedicated woman who spent her life fighting the exact same predators who had attempted to consume me. She offered me a seat, assuming I was a victim seeking their limited legal assistance. I did not ask for her sympathy, nor did I offer a dramatic explanation. Instead, I opened my leather portfolio and withdrew a certified cashier's check issued directly from the Summit corporate account. It represented the full net profit from the sale of the commercial warehouse, the same property that had once sustained my son's fragile illusion of success. I placed the check face down on her crowded desk, its weight deliberate, its meaning unmistakable. Calmly, I told her that I had recently survived a calculated attempt on both my life and my legacy, an assault orchestrated by members of my own family. I explained that I had possessed the financial armor and legal counsel to defend myself, but countless elderly men and women did not share those protections. Too many faced betrayal alone, stripped of dignity, while predators wearing familiar faces closed in around them. I told her no one should endure that terror without a ruthless advocate prepared to fight without hesitation. I asked her to turn the check over. She hesitated, then slowly flipped the heavy paper. The moment her eyes landed on the number printed across the center line, her breath caught. Her fingers trembled. The figure was not generous. It was transformational. A multi-million-dollar sum capable of funding an entire legal movement. She looked up at me, unable to speak, emotion rising visibly behind her eyes. I told her to use every cent to assemble the most aggressive corporate litigators she could find. I instructed her to build a legal strike force strong enough to dismantle anyone who viewed the elderly as disposable assets. I wanted investigators, forensic accountants, trial attorneys, an army trained to recognize financial exploitation and crush it without mercy. I stood from the chair and walked out of her modest office without waiting for gratitude. The money that had once been tainted by greed and manipulation had been purified through purpose. The poison had been extracted from my life and converted into protection for the defenseless. The following morning, sunlight spilled over the ancient oak trees that frame my estate. Long golden shadows stretched across perfectly manicured lawns. I woke not to the abrasive scrape of plastic suitcase wheels across marble floors, or the barking demands of opportunistic in-laws. I woke to silence, deep, resonant, restorative silence. The air inside my stone home felt different now. It was no longer dense with hostility or deception. It was light, crisp, entirely mine. I pushed aside the heavy silk sheets and rose from bed, feeling strength settle firmly in my bones. I crossed the plush carpet of my master suite, the same room where I had once locked myself inside, to orchestrate a counter-offensive against my own bloodline. That chapter felt distant now, like a violent storm that had raged and finally broken, leaving clear skies behind it. The house had been restored in full. Every antique remained in its rightful place. The rare silver coins were secured. The vintage wine rested untouched in the cellar. My sanctuary no longer carried the faint echo of intrusion. I entered the master bathroom and switched on the warm vanity lights. Cool water splashed across my face, clearing the final remnants of sleep. As I dried my skin with a thick cotton towel, I paused before the crystal mirror. The wound from that Easter dinner had healed months ago, but the scar remained a thin silver line tracing the curve of my cheekbone. I tilted my head slightly, allowing the light to illuminate it fully. I raised my hand and traced the faint ridge of scar tissue with my thumb. I felt no bitterness, no rage, only pride. That scar was the cost of clarity. It had torn away illusion and forced me to confront the truth. Camille had hurled the crystal goblet, intending to break me, to shock me into submission. Instead, she had shattered the false narrative of family loyalty and awakened the strategist she had underestimated. In trying to destroy me, she had triggered the unraveling of her own future. I smiled faintly at my reflection. I saw not a victim, but a man who had defended his fortress and reclaimed his ground. I dressed in linen trousers and a soft cashmere sweater, no armor required. The bespoke suits remained in the dark closet, symbols of a war already won. I descended the sweeping staircase, passing the foyer, where federal agents had once led my son away in handcuffs. The marble floors shone peacefully now, reflecting the warmth of morning light. I stepped through the French doors onto the stone patio, overlooking the gardens. The wrought iron table was already set, a silver carafe of dark roast coffee porcelain cups, and fresh pastries still warm from the oven. Moments later, the private gate hummed open. Jonathan Pierce walked along the gravel path, newspaper tucked under his arm. He wore no sharp navy suit today, only an open-collared shirt and relaxed trousers. We were no longer attorney and client locked in combat. We were two men who had endured a siege and emerged intact. He sat across from me and poured coffee into his cup. He inhaled the morning air and raised his mug slightly in a quiet toast. No words were necessary. He did not mention the federal appeals my son continued to file from his prison cell. He did not speak of the rusted trailer where Howard and Cynthia now struggled under the weight of their own choices. Those chapters were closed, sealed, archived. We had removed the malignancy and refused to dwell on the disease. Instead, we discussed global markets' shifting investment patterns and the rapid growth of the legal foundation I had funded. The attorneys assembled under that banner were already dismantling other schemes, freezing fraudulent conservatorships, exposing financial predators, restoring stolen estates. What had begun as personal defense had become institutional protection. The foundation had teeth. We fell into comfortable silence, listening to wind moving gently through the oak leaves. I lifted my coffee and took a slow sip, savoring its depth and warmth. Across the lawn, two bluebirds settled on the edge of the stone fountain, their wings flashing in the sunlight. Peace had returned, not the fragile peace of denial, but the earned peace of resolution. My home stood firm. My legacy was secured. My wealth now served a purpose greater than inheritance. And the scar on my cheek caught the light like a quiet metal proof that survival, when guided by discipline and truth, can transform even betrayal into something unbreakable. And to you listening to this story, remember this. Not every wound comes from strangers. Sometimes the deepest scars are carved by family betrayal, and sometimes the hardest battle in a family story is the one fought inside your own heart. I learned my lesson too late. I ignored warning signs. I mistook manipulation for misunderstanding. I believed that enduring disrespect was the price of keeping peace. Don't be like me. Do not wait until family betrayal turns into legal warfare before you enforce boundaries. Do not confuse silence with wisdom when action is required. I believe God was watching when I was bleeding at that table. I believe God was present when I chose restraint over rage. And I believe God allowed the truth to surface exactly when it needed to. Without God, bitterness would have consumed me. With God, I chose justice over vengeance. In this family story, faith grounded me when pride could have destroyed me. Here is my honest reflection. I was generous, but I was also naive. I was patient, but I tolerated too much. That is on me. Family betrayal did not begin the night the glass struck my face. It began the moment I allowed entitlement to grow unchecked. My opinion is simple. Boundaries are not cruelty. Accountability is not hatred. Protecting your peace is not selfish. A real family story should be built on respect, not access to your assets. And when family betrayal reveals itself, act calmly, but act decisively. If this family story speaks to you, share your thoughts below. Tell me where you would have drawn the line. Subscribe and share if you value strength, resilience, and truth. Thank you for staying with me until the end. And a final note, some upcoming stories include dramatized elements crafted for reflection and education. If that style is not for you, feel free to explore content better suited to your preferences.